Hello everyone, welcome back to AMH 2020, U.S. Introductory Survey since 1877. The 1970s is often viewed as a difficult and chaotic time in American history, and in many ways it was. It saw the continuation of the increasingly unpopular Vietnam War and the large, often acrimonious protests against the U.S. involvement in the conflict. It also saw the Watergate incident, perhaps the largest political scandal in American history, or at least the largest political scandal up to that date in American history. In addition, the counterculture movement, which began in the 60s, continued to become more mainstream in American society, sparking a backlash amongst American conservatives and other less political Americans from a variety of backgrounds. To make matters worse, the nation also faced a crippling economic recession on the backdrop of a changing economy and a continuing Cold War, and a Cold War which at the time did not seem to be going as well for the United States, to all appearances. And upon looking back at the 1970s, it can be easy to see the decade as a depressing and hopeless period in American history, especially when you compare it to the gains made during the Civil Rights Movement back in the 1960s and the economic the prosperity that the United States enjoyed in the 1950s and then in later decades like the 1980s. There were, however, some important and enduring, if controversial, laws that were passed during the 1970s that are still in effect today, and we'll be discussing those developments as well. To begin, in 1970, the Vietnam War loomed large as a concern in American public life and consciousness. President Richard Milhous Nixon, who had won the 1968 election, largely and partially on the promise of winning the Vietnam War, he struggled with his pledge of peace with honor. By 1970, the U.S. military had removed most of its ground troops, something that Nixon had talked about doing, while keeping its elite advisors deployed in the country to continue to help the faltering South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, or ARVN. Nixon had continued the removal of ground soldiers and ordered the withdrawal of American support troops as well, leading the number of American casualties to go down by at least half, which was a positive development for the American people. At the same time, however, the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War had intensified in other ways. The Nixon administration authorized the strategic bombings campaigns against the North Vietnamese, including against North Vietnamese army targets in Laos and in Cambodia, especially along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of roads and tunnels that cut through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia to keep the Viet Cong insurgency and the NVA supplied during their operations in the south. These bombings would ultimately be a part of and culminate with the Operation Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2 campaigns, and they were done in response to increased incursions by the NVA in the south. The strategic bombings did weaken the North Vietnamese military by damaging North Vietnamese industrial production. And these bombings, along with changing relations between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, they're going to lead to a shakeup in the fighting of the Vietnam War. You have the Sino-Soviet split, Sino being an old term for Chinese. The Soviet Union and China had been allies as they were both communist nations, but as time had gone on, their relationship had become more strained. And really, in terms of geopolitics, China and the Soviet Union are really not countries that you would expect to be allies. They share large borders. They have to compete for resources. They're both, regional competitors as well, particularly in Asia. Russia being an Asian and a European power. But this Sino-Soviet split will be exploited by the United States, particularly by the Nixon administration, as an opportunity to bring about peace with honor for the United States in the Vietnam conflict. And you will have a peace agreement known as the Paris Peace Accords that will be established in 1973 that temporarily brought an end to the Vietnam War, but permanently brought an end to the U.S. Intervention in Vietnam. Here are some images related to the strategic bombing of North Vietnam and targets in other countries during the linebacker operations. There was widespread criticism of these bombings because the Nixon administration in some ways had talked about de-escalating the Vietnam War, getting America less involved in the conflict, yet these bombings, particularly bombings of other countries, are escalations of war. Also, Vietnam's economy was much more agrarian, as I've mentioned before, than, say, the Japanese or the German economies were in World War II. So these bombings are going to be less effective, and there's going to be a lot of civilian casualties in North Vietnam, which is going to be very controversial. In fact, Americans who opposed the Vietnam War, who tended to be from a more liberal background, like actress Jane Fonda, they spoke out very critically against the war. In fact, Fonda even went to North Vietnam in July of 1972, and she met American prisoners of war, who in many cases had been very badly mistreated, neglected, in some cases tortured by the North Vietnamese captors at the famous Hanoi Hilton prison, for example. Fonda also posed with North Vietnamese anti-aircraft guns, the kind of guns that would have been used to shoot down these aircraft that would have led to those pilots becoming prisoners of war. In many cases, the POWs held by the North Vietnamese were pilots. And Fonda's actions were condemned by many more conservative-leaning Americans and by Vietnam veterans groups. They saw her visit as aiding the enemy. And in some ways, she was a part of North Vietnamese propaganda and became a propaganda tool for the North Vietnamese, whether she realized it or not, which she claimed that she did not realize what she was actually a part of. But I find that hard to believe. And her film career and really her general reputation in many ways never recovered after her visit to North Vietnam. On the left-hand side of the slide is an image of the Paris Peace Accords, which led to the last U.S. troops being removed from Vietnam, and what many hoped would be an ending to the conflict in Vietnam. Although reports that came out later between the North Vietnamese and the U.S. revealed that even as the U.S. was trying to have peace with honor, in many ways the Paris Peace Accords were meant to really be a face-saving measure for the United States. This would give the United States an opportunity to leave the country without being labeled as having been defeated, and then perhaps in the near future, after what was called a reasonable interval, that was the language used, North Vietnam might end up retaking or taking control of, rather, of South Vietnam. But we'll talk a bit more about that later on in the video. On the right-hand side of the slide is President Nixon's very publicized visit to the People's Republic of China in February of 1972. This was a historic moment because China, as a communist country, had been an enemy of the United States, and they had been an ally of the Soviets. But the Nixon administration, recognizing the need to change up the status quo in Asia, went to China. Nixon met with Mao Zedong. He toured the Great Wall, as you can see in this image. And Nixon could do this for a variety of reasons. The first reason was because he'd built up a reputation as a committed anti-communist, going all the way back to when he was just a congressman and investigating people like Alger Hiss, for example. Another politician did not have such an anti-communist reputation. They may have been accused of being a communist sympathizer or a fellow traveler or a pinko. These are not my terms. These are terms that they would have used, in America at this point. But Nixon could do this. Also, Nixon, although he's seen by many as a conservative, he was really very across the board on political issues and political ideology. He was very pragmatic. So perhaps a more principled conservative would have refused to meet with Mao. Mao being a mass murderer, a communist, very oppressive to the Chinese people. But Nixon was willing to make those compromises, to have those meetings, to try to get a better situation in Vietnam, and really to try to break up an alliance between the Soviets and between the Chinese, which had been breaking up though for many years before, and not just because of geopolitical concerns, but even ideological concerns. Maoist communism under Mao Zedong, in addition to being very oppressive, it's very focused on agrarianism and basically on changing the countryside, making the countryside kind of more industrial. You can see this in not only in Mao's Little Red Book, but in actual Chinese communist policies, the various great leaps forward and things of that nature. Whereas Russian communism, Soviet communism, is definitely more industrially focused, and I would say urban industrially focused. But at the same time, communist ideologies often change, and the communist ideology in the Soviet Union can change depending on who is the Soviet dictator or premier. There's Stalinism under Stalin. There's the ideologies of later leaders like Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev. Just as there's different types of fascism, there's different types of communism that can also lead to breakups between the various communist states, which Nixon was able to recognize and was able to exploit for the United States' benefit. Also, I should add that in the 1970s, the attitude towards the Cold War in the United States amongst U.S. politicians changed. We actually, in some ways, become less aggressive against the Soviet Union as well, just as we're reaching out to China. This is called the détente phase of the Cold War, and it really actually begins with Nixon, who again is trying to get America out of Vietnam in as non-damaging a way as possible. He's reaching out to China, but also there's a more of a live and let live attitude that begins to take over in U.S. foreign policy. In the 1950s and early 1960s, we were focused on containment. We were focused on domino theory. That's going to change in the 1970s. It's going to become the era of détente, and largely because of the Vietnam War in the beginning of the 1970s. But later in the 70s, internal concerns are also going to drive this détente strategy. And détente was driven not just by the United States' precarious position in Vietnam, but by domestic divisions that were really tearing the United States apart in the early 1970s. On the home front, Americans continued to protest their military's involvement in the Vietnam War. Initially, protesters were angry about the draft and about the high number of American casualties, but over time, the demonstrators began to more broadly condemn the American military overall and the U.S. government for the destruction that it had been visited on the Vietnamese people during the war, not just on North Vietnamese people with the bombing campaigns, but even on South Vietnamese people who were being killed in things like the My Lai massacre, for example. The Vietnam War was a brutal conflict in which both sides committed violence against civilians. You saw this during the Tet Offensive by the NVA. There's evidence of other events like this. So you have violence against civilians being done by many different factions. And many Vietnam veterans did oppose the war and even campaigned against it. Other veterans supported the conflict, or at least wanted to see America exit the conflict honorably. There's depends on which polls you look at. I would say, though, that more radical protesters, they're going to adopt anti-military rhetoric, referring to soldiers as baby killers, veterans coming home, or soldiers and U.S. military personnel off duty can be harassed, even spat on or assaulted during this period. And so many American servicemen will actually try to hide the fact that they're in the military to avoid this kind of harassment. I talked to a guy who was in the Navy during the Vietnam War era, and he he was in the Navy, not the Army. He wasn't boots on the ground in Vietnam. But when he had shore leave in New York City, he was told by his commanding officer, don't wear your Navy uniform when you go on shore leave. Wear civilian clothing because you could be harassed, you could be treated very badly by people who are upset about the conduct of the war. And you can see here on this slide, American protesters not just protesting against the Vietnam War, they're protesting in favor of North Vietnam. As you can see, they are holding the North Vietnamese flag, and there are protests on college campuses, as you can see here. This is actually from the University of Florida during this period. And they're not just protesting against the Vietnam War, they're protesting against what they call U.S. imperialism, U.S. Cold War strategy. And this is John Kerry. He was a Navy veteran who did actually do service on river service, brown water Navy service in Vietnam. He actually was he received Purple Hearts during his service as well for wounds he sustained, and he testified at the Winter Soldier investigation in Detroit in 1971, in which veterans spoke about the war. They spoke about alleged violence against Vietnamese civilians. They spoke about racism within the U.S. military. There were critiques and criticisms of the people who spoke. Some people claimed that either some of the speakers were not really veterans or that they were not being honest about their service. They even made those allegations about Kerry himself. People began to ask questions of how did he earn those Purple Hearts based on where he was in Vietnam and when. Things that are actually going to come up later when he runs for president in the 2004 election. And there were organizations that were led by veterans that opposed the war, most notably Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which that organization did have veteran membership, but there were other criticisms that there were people who were not actually honest about their service, that non-veterans were infiltrating it, and there was also concerns, allegations that the organization was being infiltrated by communists as well, which there is some evidence of that because the Vietnam Veterans for the War organization actually split between its more radical members and its less radical members. And this has been attested to by veterans of the Vietnam War who wanted to see the war end, but did not want to get involved in an organization that was going to be too radical. I'll also say, too, that when you look at polls, though, of Vietnam War veterans, you'll find that the majority of American veterans who went to Vietnam, first of all, while there was conscription and while there were drafts during this period, the majority of the people who ended up in Vietnam were volunteers, not draftees, actually. In World War II, the majority of the U.S. military was made up of draftees, but in Vietnam, the opposite was the case. The majority of the people who went to Vietnam were volunteers. Now, there are two caveats for this, though. The first caveat is people in this period often voluntarily joined the military to avoid being drafted. By voluntarily joining, you had a lot more choice about your occupation specialty. You might join the military hoping to get a assignment perhaps in Europe or in stateside service to avoid Vietnam, or you would choose a non-combat position. When you look at the actual troops in Vietnam, though, draftees disproportionately made up the infantry. The combat positions, the most dangerous positions. So in absolute numbers, the majority of the people who went to Vietnam were volunteers, but the majority of the combat troops were draftees. And it's also true that while the majority of Americans who went to Vietnam were white, African Americans were disproportionately represented in the U.S. military in Vietnam. And there's been arguments that this is because African Americans were poorer than white Americans. They were less likely to be able to get deferments, like deferments from college attendance. And some of those things are true. You also find, though, that many African Americans remained in the military for longer, even after their contracts had ended. And we argue that this often took place because opportunities for veterans at home were often not very good. For black veterans at home were not very good, and so they would remain in the military for longer. Not necessarily because they were forced to remain longer, but because it was a better opportunity than going back home. There were also allegations, particularly at things like the Winter Soldier hearings, that black troops were purposely put in more dangerous positions than white troops, which is actually the opposite of what was done in World War II and earlier conflicts where black troops were kept out of dangerous combat situations with the belief that they could not handle those dangers. What we find is that, yes, in many cases, African American soldiers were in more dangerous positions, but in many cases, it was because the pay for those positions was better. And again, African American troops looking for better opportunities that were not available to them domestically, they would remain in the military for longer. They may have had a harder time getting out of the draft, but often they chose more dangerous assignments because the opportunities and pay were better. College campuses were epicenters of Vietnam War protests and of larger countercultural protests as well in the 1960s and in the 1970s. College students who were disproportionately white and from the middle class and upper middle class, they would have deferments as long as they were in college, and they could get deferments for certain types of graduate education as well. They were less likely to be drafted, but they had friends who maybe weren't in college who could be drafted, and after graduation, you could be drafted. I actually had someone I spoke to interviewed who was a college student during this period, and he received his draft letter as soon as he graduated from college. He actually asked for another deferment because he had plans to go to law school. He said, I'll even come back and I'll serve as a JAG lawyer once I graduate. But they said, no, you've got to go to Vietnam. And he actually did end up going to Vietnam, and he did come home safe and sound. But the most famous of the college protests in this period in the 1970s took place at Kent State in Ohio. And they're very famous because of the Kent State shootings. And at the Kent State shootings on May 4th, 1970, soldiers from the Ohio National Guard fired on student protesters who were protesting and rioting at the school. The students were protesting the Vietnam War itself, but they were also protesting the Cambodian incursion by the U.S. military, as well as the continued presence of the National Guard on the university campus. There was a lot of anger with the National Guard as well during this period because the National Guard was involved in suppressing riots, what would be called law and order by some, others would call suppression. At the same time, also, the National Guard was often a place where people would sign up for service in the National Guard with the hope of actually going and getting out of going to Vietnam potentially. And basically what happened was this. The protests at Kent State, they started out peacefully, but became more violent over time, as protests often do. Several buildings, including the Kent State ROTC Center, were actually destroyed. And some of this property damage may have been done by people who actually had no affiliation with the student protesters, and they were just looking for an opportunity for arson and vandalism. On Monday, May 4th, about 2,000 students gathered on campus to protest on the university commons. Guardsmen arrived at the scene and ordered the students to disperse, and they were acting under orders themselves from the university administration, who wanted the protest canceled and did not want any more university property to be destroyed. The guardsmen launched tear gas grenades at the students, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. The students shouted epithets at the guardsmen, calling them pigs, a derogatory term for law enforcement, because the guard was acting in a law enforcement capacity here. The students also threw rocks and tear gas canisters back at the soldiers. That is, tear gas canisters fired by the guardsmen were thrown back at them. At approximately 12:24 p.m., the soldiers fired on the protesters. About 30 guardsmen fired over 60 rounds of ammunition over the course of about 13 seconds. In the shooting, 4 students were killed and 9 were wounded. All the protesters that were shot were students of the university. In the wake of the killings, what some referred to as a massacre, the university condemned the conduct of the guardsmen and the student protesters. The Nixon administration condemned the killings, although Nixon himself appeared rather ambivalent. 5 of the guardsmen were indicted on felony charges, and more were brought up on misdemeanors, but the guardsmen argued that they had acted in self-defense. And I think they had a pretty good argument. They were, having rocks thrown at them and tear gas canisters being thrown at them, but they were responding with deadly force. You might say it was disproportionate force. The prosecution and critics of the guardsmen claimed that the protesters were too far away to have put the guardsmen's lives in danger. Um, the defense would have said they were defending themselves against violence, but the justice system ultimately decided not to find the guardsmen guilty. The Kent State shooting would inspire massive national protest in which college students, up to about 4 million, protested the Vietnam War and the U.S. government. They boycotted their exams, they protested, they demonstrated, and even though the American public had come to oppose the war, they generally supported the guardsmen and the Nixon administration's handling of the case, believing that um, the college students were getting to be too radical, that they had disobeyed orders to vacate the campus, and they had responded with violence, which is what led to them being shot at by the guardsmen. This is sort of the attitude of what you might call the vast silent majority that President Nixon was trying to reach out to amongst everyday Americans who disliked the Vietnam War, but also disliked the massive social turbulence that the country was facing in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The Kent State shooting would also have significant impacts on how the U.S. National Guard and civilian law enforcement organizations will handle protests and riots in the future. Specifically, these killings would lead to the issue of what are called less than lethal arms and materiel, things like rubber bullets and riot shields and better riot gear for law enforcement for the National Guard. You may not see rocks being thrown at you as a threat if you have a proper shield to protect yourself. And you won't respond with deadly force, you'll respond with non-lethal force, pepper balls or rubber bullets, things of that nature, which is a violent response, but it's not a form of deadly force. It's more proportional. The Kent State shooting and the protests that came in its wake reveal the discontent that many young people had with the Nixon administration and the state of U.S. politics and culture as a whole. Young people's protests helped to inspire the passage of the 26th Amendment to the Constitution on July 1st, 1971. The 26th Amendment declared that states could not bar anyone who was 18 or older from voting. And there had been efforts to lower voting ages on the state level for many years before the 1970s. But the Vietnam War, the anger of many young people, and not without reason, led to this change, this expansion of the right to vote with the 26th Amendment, which it was supported by President Nixon. But with constitutional amendments, the president's signature is not what signs the amendment into law. It's Congress drafts the law and passes it, and then the states ratify it. But a president's signature or an endorsement does make a big difference. It can convince states to ratify a constitutional amendment. And the language at the time, as you can see on this button here, is old enough to fight, old enough to vote. There was a well, it wasn't old back then, anti-war protest song that said, "You're old enough to kill, but not for votin'. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're totin'?" The idea was you ought to be able to have a right to vote, because if you can vote, you may not vote for politicians who will start wars or have you drafted. Equal fights, equal rights. And I would class the 26th Amendment alongside other legislation in American history that enlarged the franchise. Things like the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protected African Americans' voting rights and called for the U.S. government to take a more proactive role in helping people secure their voting rights. The great irony, though, with American politics is that as the right to vote is extended to more people, as the franchise gets bigger, voter turnout does go down. Why this is, there's considerable debate, but it is a trend that we do notice. And I wanted to make one more note about Nixon's politics. He was a politician that was across the board on a variety of issues, which I'll explain more as we go further into the video. He was often criticized by many more liberal and left-leaning Americans for being very culturally and socially conservative, even if he did actually support other more liberal policies. And a lot of this came down to Nixon's personal style, the way he spoke, the way he dressed. He was really, in many ways, the antithesis of counterculture, which was much more about being informal and rejecting a lot of middle class, mid century values. Nixon really leaned into those values, both he and his wife, First Lady Pat Nixon. Some of this was because Nixon actually came from very humble backgrounds. He grew up in a poor family, and as he became wealthier and wealthier and got into politics, in some ways he didn't know how to have the that demure sense of almost false humility, that anti-conspicuous consumption sentiment that many wealthier people in America believe, where you're kind of ashamed almost of your wealth. Nixon leaned into his wealth and his position as president. He was accused of being an imperial president, not only in terms of his foreign policy, but even in how he dressed. Always dressed to the nines in nice suits, and even in the uniforms that he had the Secret Service wear when they were guarding the White House. These were worn from 1970 actually to 1974. You can see them on this slide. They were widely mocked by Nixon's opponents during the period because they were very showy. These fancy white uniforms, the covers they wear, the hats they wear look a little bit more like what a band member would wear than a member of the U.S. military. And in some ways, we do have very nice military uniforms here in America, but historians of fashion and uniforms have said that countries that have fancy uniforms are often the first to lose wars, whereas countries with less fancy uniforms, they're the ones that win wars. Look at the really fancy uniforms worn by the British in the American Revolution, those red uniforms. Look at the fancy uniforms worn by the Nazis in World War II compared to the simpler uniforms worn by Americans. So it felt very un-American to many people. And you get that from these what I think are very funny political cartoons here. The bottom one says, "It's the new White House ceremonial dress for a sustained veto." So they're making fun of the uniforms with commenting on Nixon's politics. And the author of the cartoon wrote a little note in the bottom to Dick Nixon, "Best wishes for a long reign." And they have Nixon dressed up in a uniform while his guards look on. The other one above it is when the British Prime Minister visited the White House, and Nixon says, "Mr. Wilson, it does nothing for our special relationship to have you laugh at my new White House Guard uniform." That special relationship being brought up between the British and the United States. So it does show you how many people viewed Nixon. They really criticized his style and his way of doing things, even if maybe there were actually policies that they supported. And now we've come to the 1972 election. In 1972, Richard Nixon was the incumbent president. In many ways, he was a very embattled incumbent. He's still trying to get America out of the Vietnam War. He's still trying to achieve peace with honor. Negotiations between North Vietnam and the United States had not been going very well. And for a brief period, Vietnam actually left the negotiation table, likely because they were trying to see what was going to happen with the 72 election. U.S. domestic policy has significant international implications. Nixon was still trying to reach that vast silent majority that he described in the late 1960s, which included many white working class people, many blue-collar workers across the country, as well as even white Southerners who are beginning to fall out of love with the Democratic Party and are being ushered into the Republican Party with Nixon's Southern strategy, with his promises of law and order. Critics of Nixon suggest that he's using racist dog whistle tactics, that he's telling voters secret messages, coded language to get them to vote for him. But Nixon had supported civil rights as a younger politician. And I think Nixon himself, he saw himself as the third way. a moderate between the rising liberalism in the Democratic Party and the reactionary segregationism of George Wallace, a former Democrat who had left to become an independent. George Wallace also will run in 1972 as an independent segregationist, but he will drop out of the race after being shot, after surviving an assassination attempt. So many Wallace voters, if they were going to continue to vote in the November election, they would have voted very likely for Richard Nixon, which was a continuation of the Southern strategy. For the Democrats, they choose George McGovern to be their nominee for president. McGovern was a politician from South Dakota, a congressman and then a senator, and he was a very liberal candidate by the standards of the day. He'd actually been a history college professor as well, kind of like Woodrow Wilson before he got into politics. And he was supported by the liberal members of the Democratic Party, the so-called liberal elites that were predominantly on East Coast cities and urban centers, as well as some urban centers in the Midwest as well, and the West Coast. And there was concern that was exploited quite well by Republicans that McGovern did not represent the values of everyday Americans who in the past might have voted Democrat, everyday blue-collar Americans, everyday working class and lower middle class white Americans, that he represented the kind of elite academic bureaucracy of the country, what might be called the limousine liberals in the language of the late 60s and early 70s. By the way, that the term limousine liberal was actually used by a working class Italian Democratic candidate for mayor against a liberal Republican mayor in the late 1960s, but now it's often associated with an attack used by Republicans against liberal Democrats who are often of the upper class, often college educated, often very well connected politically and socially. And the perception was that McGovern was too tight with those intellectual elite types who are often very liberal, and he was also too tight with radical student activists and with, in some cases, minority voters, that in some ways he was leaving white working class and middle class voters behind. And you see that with this campaign button, which features a rainbow, which is not an LGBT rainbow. It's, I think, a reference to the Rainbow Coalition, which was a group of African American and Latino activists that began to emerge in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Chicago. They were actually led by Jesse Jackson, an African American minister. But by the standards of the day, McGovern was a very liberal candidate, a lot like Barry Goldwater was for the conservatives. He was essentially a very principled man, very clear in his politics, even if it was often to the detriment of his own political career, often unbending. Goldwater was unbending in his conservatism, McGovern was unbending in his liberalism. They were kind of mirror images of each other. And the established unions, they did not back McGovern, even though they usually back Democrats. Nixon's campaign outspent McGovern's by about 2-1. Really, he did not have the kind of support that a more centrist Democrat would have had. And I say liberal by the standards of the day because there are certain issues that McGovern supported that would not be considered liberal today. He may have called for an immediate end to the Vietnam War, even if he had to crawl on his hands and knees, was the language that he used to end the war, which is not what Nixon said. Nixon said peace with honor. On abortion, McGovern believed that abortion should be up to the states, that if a state wants to make it legal to have abortion, then they should be allowed to do so. And if they don't want it to be legal, then they should not make it legal, which some of the more liberal members of the party thought that was not a radical enough stance. But McGovern believed that he did not want to be too much of a radical on the issue. So he was a very liberal candidate by the standards of the day, but that stance on abortion would mean that he would not be liberal enough in the present. But he lost significantly, very resoundingly to Nixon in 72. He only won Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. He even lost his home state of South Dakota, whereas Nixon won across the country, north, south, east, and west. Although Congress, the congressional down-ballot elections, did not go well for the Republican Party, especially the conservatives in the Republican Party. And that's going to be a problem for Nixon during his second term, as you're about to see. So there are signs of cracks in the Nixon administration that emerged during the 1972 election, which I'll get to in a moment. But during the 1970s, you also have other revelations, particularly about U.S. intelligence community operations in the United States, not only by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, spying on Americans, but even on operations being done by the CIA. The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, it goes against its charter. It is illegal for the CIA to operate within U.S. borders, but they do operate inside the U.S. So some examples of intelligence operations in the United States: COINTELLIGENCE, or COINTELPRO, 1956-1971. This was revealed by a burglary, actually, in March of 1971 in a town called Media, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Philadelphia. A group called the Citizens Commission, an anti-FBI group, they broke into the FBI office and they found evidence of immense domestic surveillance programs. This was something that J. Edgar Hoover, FBI director, was very involved in, surveilling Martin Luther King Jr. and other what were called New Left radicals, as well as some right-wing organizations as well. Some of these neo-Confederate organizations were also surveilled, but the FBI was gathering dirt on these people and spying on them, in many cases without proper warrants. And this is a violation of the Fourth Amendment rights of these people. Even if they have radical politics, they still have constitutional rights. And there also are revelations about MK Ultra. MK Ultra was a intelligence program designed basically to, you might say, brainwash people using drugs and things like that. This operation began in 1953 and it lasted until 1973. And what inspired MK Ultra was American POWs were captured by the North Koreans during the Korean War, were eventually liberated and returned to the United States. But many of them had seemingly been brainwashed by the North Koreans and become communist. And American intelligence officials and in the U.S. government, they were concerned about this. We don't want to have this happen, and we want to be able to do this ourselves. So there's going to be experiments with drugs and with what you might call brainwashing and propaganda as part of MK Ultra. And Operation Mockingbird, 1951 to 1974. This was CIA agents getting involved with news organizations to basically to run various types of propaganda and what might also be called misinformation or disinformation in our modern language. And this was not just happening outside the United States, it was happening inside the United States as well. And you're going to see all kinds of people all across the political spectrum. They're going to have ties to the CIA. And I'll give examples in this video. And a lot of these operations, they were fully investigated and compiled in a report by Frank Church, a senator. It's called the Church Committee Report, 1975 to 1976. And Angela Davis was one of the people, the Black Power leader, who was also surveilled as part of things like COINTELPRO. And although I am criticizing the operations of the intelligence community here and the violation of the constitutional rights of the people they're surveilling, I'm not necessarily endorsing the values and beliefs of these New Left activists or of some of the right-wing activists as well that were also surveilled. So now we come to Watergate. And you can't talk about Richard Nixon without talking about Watergate. So think about the COINTELPRO break-in. Think about operations by the intelligence community inside the United States, operations that in many cases were illegal and also in many cases unethical as well. So it started out 5 agents of the Nixon reelection campaign. They broke into the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. And they were there officially to collect dirt on McGovern by planting listening devices and to just gather any kind of compromising information that could help Nixon win the 1972 election, which Nixon was ahead in the polls. His campaign was much better funded. There's questions about why did this need to take place? Did this need to happen in order to help Nixon get reelected? But these men were discovered and they were arrested. And it was found that they were linked to his campaign. But Nixon did have a reputation for certain underhanded operations and things like that to try to protect his position as president. He had what were called the White House plumbers, which were people who were tasked with stopping leaks, because plumbers stop leaks. He had the Dirty Tricks Squad, a group of people that were tasked with finding compromising information on his political opponents. Nixon was also, in some ways you might say, paranoid as well. He recorded his conversations a lot like Lyndon Johnson, his predecessor, did. And he wanted to be able to record these conversations. That way, if there ever was a leak that wasn't caught, and it was reported on by the media in a negative way, he could say, well, this is what I actually said. And he could play the recording back. Which, recording people without their consent, there is debate about the ethics of that, of course. Others have also suggested that after J. Edgar Hoover passed away, Nixon appointed L. Patrick Gray as the acting FBI director, and that angered agents within the FBI who felt that Gray was an outsider and should not have been in that position. Anyway, though, this break-in takes place during the 72 election. The first coverage actually begins in the summer of 1972. Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, they begin to report on the Watergate break-in. They have anonymous sources, at least one anonymous source, the most famous of which was called Deep Throat. That was the code name for Deep Throat, and it's not a reference to having a gravelly, raspy voice. It's actually a reference to a very popular pornographic film from the 1970s. People used to actually go watch pornographic films at movie theaters in this period because there were no streaming back then. There was no DVDs or anything back then. But that was where the name Deep Throat came from. We now believe that a guy named Mark Felt was most likely Deep Throat. And in these meetings, it comes out that Watergate is only the tip of the iceberg for corruption within the Nixon administration. And there had been allegations of corruption in the Nixon presidency. Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to be removed for corruption and was actually replaced by Gerald Ford, who will eventually become president. And moving into 1973, White House counselors claim that they discussed the Watergate breakup with the president. And in the recordings, there's evidence that Nixon wanted to mislead the FBI that was investigating the break-in. And he wanted to make the FBI think that they had stumbled on a CIA operation within the United States, and that since it was CIA, they ought to drop it and not investigate any further. I've listened to the recordings, and they're not as direct as Nixon saying, this is what we're going to do. We're going to mislead the FBI into thinking this is a CIA operation. It's usually other people proposing various plans, and then Nixon basically going, yeah, okay, things of that nature. They're definitely worth listening to, the actual recordings that were turned over. So Nixon was ordered to return or turn over recordings. He withheld about 18 or so minutes of recordings, which There were claims that the recordings were lost, that they were not transcribed, that the tape recorder wasn't on. In the end, Nixon will claim executive privilege, and there's going to be a very important Supreme Court case that's going to come out of that, which I'll go over later in the video. But moving into 1973 and then into 1974, more reports of corruption in the administration come out, and things are looking worse and worse for Nixon. He's having meetings with members of Congress who basically say that, we have the votes to impeach you in the House and then to convict you in the Senate. And while Nixon defended his conduct, in the end, he elected to resign from the presidency. And he's the only U.S. president to ever resign as of 2025. And here are the famous WAPO journalists, Woodward and Bernstein, who broke the Watergate story with reports from Mark Felt, an FBI agent who did not like Nixon and who had wanted to be director. That is true. I'm not saying that Felt was not telling the truth, but he did have other motives. And people have alleged that Woodward, who you see on the right-hand side of the image of the two reporters, they've alleged that he possibly had ties to alphabet agencies, possibly to the CIA, because he had very little journalistic experience, yet here he is breaking this huge story. I have not been able to find credible evidence that he was tied to the CIA, but the CIA did operate inside the United States, and they did have ties to news organizations via Operation Mockingbird. I think really what it was is he was at the right place at the right time, and he had the right source, Deep Throat, Mark Felt. And that does happen sometimes, in journalism. You're investigating something, and then you get to break the story of the century. And here on the right-hand side is Nixon addressing the American people, in which he famously told the American people, "I am not a crook." He did, however, resign in the end. And after he resigned, Gerald Ford, his second vice president, became the president. And there's no credible evidence that Ford was involved in the Watergate break-in or in any of the alleged corruption in the Nixon administration. Ford's political experience was much more limited, and he was brought into the Nixon administration after Spiro Agnew was removed from office. By the way, if you're wondering what kind of name Spiro Agnew is, he was from Maryland, but he was of Greek ancestry. So now we'll talk a little bit more about Nixon in retrospect and Nixon's policies, because when people think of Nixon, they think of the Vietnam War and they think of Watergate. They often don't think about his domestic politics. Maybe they've heard of the Southern Strategy, but that's about it. He was a politician who was very complex, very nuanced. He had political issues and beliefs from across the board. He was very pragmatic. You might call him in many ways a moderate Republican, although he was very culturally conservative in his style, in his substance, in the way he spoke and acted and lived his life. He did support many liberal issues as well. But to begin, Nixon in many ways did intensify the war on drugs, which some people might support, some people might condemn. The drug scheduling system came out in 1970 with his support, and marijuana became much more tightly restricted. There were increased penalties for trafficking of drugs, but believe it or not, in some of these early laws that were being done in the Nixon administration, possession actually was not going to be as strictly punished. So in some ways he intensified the war on drugs. In other ways he actually perhaps slowed it down a bit. On racial issues, Nixon, as a young politician, had supported civil rights, but he'd become less vocal in his support over time in order to differentiate himself from other politicians. You also have to remember, too, that Nixon was out of politics during the time of the Civil Rights Act being passed, the Voting Rights Act being passed in 64 and 65. He'd vowed to leave politics back in 60 after losing the gubernatorial race for California in 62. But he came back into politics with running for president in the 68 election and again in 72. And Nixon did oversee the Southern Strategy, bringing in white Southern voters, many of whom were opposed to civil rights. he worked to bring them into the Republican Party. But Nixon himself would not have regarded himself as a segregationist. He believed in the middle way, is what he would have called it, that he was trying to offer an alternative between the liberalism of a candidate like George McGovern and the aggressive segregationism of George Wallace, trying to reach a variety of groups. Nixon would have just seen this as being good politics. In terms of monetary policy, he did make efforts to take the dollar off of the gold standard. This was part of the Nixon shock to the economy. The idea was loosening up the money supply would lead to more government spending, and it would stimulate the economy. And Nixon often is criticized for the Nixon shock, but in some ways he was really continuing to do what other politicians before him had done, what Kennedy had done, loosening up the money supply, what FDR had done back in the 30s with the Gold Reserve Act of basically, you might say, confiscating the gold coins of everyday Americans. So he does complete the transformation of turning America's money from a system backed up by precious metals to a fiat money system where there is no backing, no precious metal backing for the dollar. In many ways, though, you might say that while this may have helped the economy short term, it did lead to the stagflation that you see in the 1970s. That was really a scourge for everyday Americans at the same time. On environmental policies, modern environmentalism really emerged in America in the 1970s, and Nixon in some ways did play a role in this environmental movement that emerged. He helped to create the EPA, he helped to create the Endangered Species Act, he also created other regulations, or helped to create other regulations like OSHA, which was about workers' safety, things that you might not associate with conservative candidates, these kind of regulations. Medicaid was also expanded during Nixon's presidency as well. And Nixon also supported things like the Equal Rights Act and Title IX. The Equal Rights Act being legislation to put an end to gender discrimination, which kind of comes out of the second wave feminist movement that emerges in the 1960s and 1970s. Nixon did support much of this legislation. And affirmative action, Nixon was a supporter of affirmative action as well, which affirmative action has become a very controversial subject. It was controversial in the 70s, but it's controversial today as well. You wouldn't see conservative candidates supporting affirmative action in the way that Nixon, a conservative, did. And I think this is because Nixon was so focused on having a conservative style and a conservative reputation that it allowed him to be more flexible on other political issues. You could support liberal issues while not losing his conservative reputation and while not losing the vote of many middle American voters. Really, in many ways, Nixon is a brilliant politician, and I think had it not been for Watergate, he probably would be remembered much more positively. You know, an example is people across the political perspective, if they're more knowledgeable on history, have acknowledged this, and I see this even with public figures. For example, the liberal television host Stephen Colbert has said that there's many things that he admires about Nixon, and Colbert is certainly not a conservative in any way. On the conservative side of politics, Roger Stone, a former advisor and ally of Donald Trump, is a fan of Nixon and has said that Nixon was one of the best presidents we've ever had. And I don't know if it's true or not. Apparently, he has a back tattoo of Richard Nixon's face. I've never seen Roger Stone shirtless. I've only ever seen him like wearing really nice suits and things like that. He actually, for a while, he was attending the church that my mother went to. Small world. But again, people across the political perspectives, if they know more about Nixon beyond just the Vietnam War and Watergate, actually admit that there's things that they like about Nixon. And I would say he would be remembered more positively had he not engaged in Watergate, tried to cover up Watergate, etc. During the realizations about Watergate, U.S. National Security Advisor and Eventually, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was the primary negotiator for the United States in the Paris Peace Accords. He negotiated the peace treaty that led to the U.S. Removing its last troops from Vietnam. He made the agreement with Lee Duc Tho, the leader of the North Vietnamese Politburo. This was arranged in 1973. There were stops in negotiations. Nixon argued that Linebacker 2, particularly the Christmas bombings that happened at Christmas time in 1972, that they forced North Vietnam back to the negotiation table and allowed Kissinger to finish up the negotiations. And negotiations were as follows. The United States would remove its troops from South Vietnam, and U.S. prisoners of war would be liberated. Officially, all prisoners of war were liberated, but some claim that other POWs were left behind. South Vietnam would be an independent country, separate from North Vietnam, and the U.S. would militarily support South Vietnam, not with troops, but with supplies. Basically, it was like a dollar for dollar, bullet for bullet plan. And if North Vietnam did not abide by this treaty, then the United States had some flexibility to possibly send troops back to the country. But domestically speaking, that would have been a very unpopular move. The thing is, though, to really call this a victory for South Vietnam and the United States would be a stretch, because the treaty did not call for or mandate the evacuation of the North Vietnamese army, which was still in South Vietnamese territory even after the treaty was signed. While it was reported by some that this was an end to the Vietnam War, in many ways it really was not. And other things that complicated the treaty afterward: Nixon's resignation in 1974, the resumption of the presidency by Gerald Ford, and during this period as well, the U.S. Congress, which was controlled by anti-war factions in the Democratic Party, and as well as some more liberal-leaning Republicans, they're going to pass the War Powers Act, which drastically limited the U.S. president's executive power to conduct military operations without congressional approval. And while in many ways that's a good thing, because it limits the power of the executive branch, it puts the power of declaring war back in the hands of Congress, where it was always intended to be in the Constitution. It means that unpopular military operations, which perhaps are necessary to secure, American goals abroad, they're going to be much more difficult to be done. Also, the military funding for South Vietnam is going to be cut as well. So without military support and without financial support from the United States, in the end, South Vietnam will be defeated by North Vietnam in 1975. But it's 1975. You might say that a reasonable interval had taken place since the Paris Peace Accords. So the Paris Peace Accords were not a complete failure. In the end, over 58,000 American military personnel were killed in the Vietnam War over the course of nearly 20 years. Up to that point, it was America's longest war, only to be eclipsed by the war in Afghanistan and the war on terror. The conflict cost the U.S. over $800 billion in today's money. It's the fourth most expensive war the U.S. has ever fought. And although the war was very violent and costly, it looms large in the American consciousness and public memory of the 1960s and 1970s. When I hear the words 1960s, 1970s, the first thing I think about is the Vietnam War. It shaded popular culture, film, music during this period. Even things like fashion were impacted by the Vietnam conflict. It remains a large part of American culture and in memory. President Nixon resigned in 1974. Gerald Ford did not have the will or the political capital and power to fulfill the Paris Peace Accords commitments to South Vietnam. And consequently, the North Vietnamese Army, which had been renamed to the People's Army of Vietnam, the PAVN, they continued to push southward in South Vietnam, and they're going to take control of most of South Vietnam by 1975. And Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital, will eventually fall on April 30th, 1975. And you can see images of Saigon's capture here on this slide. In the days leading up to Saigon's fall, U.S. Diplomats in the U.S. Embassy, they worked to evacuate their embassy and to work and to evacuate South Vietnamese people who had supported the United States. There were helicopters leaving with Americans and with South Vietnamese as the North Vietnamese were breaking into the U.S. Embassy with tanks, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. Saigon fell, it was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and South Vietnam was absorbed into the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, a single country ruled by a communist government. And thousands of South Vietnamese refugees fled the country. Those that had worked with the United States were concerned about being persecuted by the North Vietnamese. Those who did not want to live in a communist country, Catholics, those that perhaps had supported the French decades earlier, they wanted to leave the country, and understandably so. And it's estimated that at least 1 million South Vietnamese were arrested and put into basically like concentration camps by the North Vietnamese, of which at least 250,000 died as a result of mistreatment in those camps. Vietnam as a single socialist country was communist, and it was not a democracy. It was a very authoritarian place. And while I can sympathize with their nationalist sentiment, their desire for independence, I can't condone this kind of treatment of these are now your people, your fellow Vietnamese people. These Vietnamese refugees are commonly called the boat people because they fled their country by boat. They settle in other nations in Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, for example, and others will try to reach America, where unfortunately many of them will encounter racial discrimination, even though they had been former allies of the United States. And many of these Vietnamese people set up communities around the United States. Many immigrants often create ethnic enclaves where people of a similar culture live together. There are Vietnamese ethnic enclaves in places like Southeast Texas and in Central Florida, particularly in the Orlando area as well. As I said, also many Vietnamese people settled in places like the Philippines too. A good friend of mine actually, his family fled South Vietnam during this period. They moved to the Philippines, and eventually they moved to the United States, and he actually joined the U.S. military as an adult. So many of these people became very loyal and in support of the United States, even if many of them did face discrimination. And they worked in a variety of businesses. Many of them perhaps they opened things like Vietnamese restaurants, nail salons, and places like that. And this is because discrimination, it's often hard to find jobs in other industries. So ethnic enclaves, they often use elements of their own culture to go into business, or they do jobs that are seen as being less desirable. Working in a nail salon, for example, there's a lot of chemicals and things like that that make it less desirable work. But these Vietnamese American people, became important parts of their community and really an important part of America as well. And the image you're seeing on the bottom right-hand side of the slide, those are boots that were taken off by fleeing ARVN soldiers. They wanted to hide the fact they had been in the South Vietnamese army because they could be killed or persecuted by the North Vietnamese. So they removed any parts of their uniforms down to their footwear. In the wake of the fall of South Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia both became communist countries. These are neighbors of Vietnam. They're part of the larger Indochina region, and there had been U.S. military operations in these countries against communists as well. And they're going to fall to communism in 1970. Both of these countries became communist in 1975, in the same year that Vietnam was unified under a single communist government. In Cambodia, the Communist Party was called the Khmer Rouge, and they took over the country, and they were led by Pol Pot, who you see on the right-hand side of this slide. And um, Cambodia was allied with China. They supported more like a Maoist Chinese type of communism, which you can see Pol Pot's wearing a Chinese-style, what's called a Mao suit. And under Pol Pot's rule, about 2 million Cambodians, about a quarter of the Cambodian population, were killed or died from abuse and maltreatment by the government. Very brutal totalitarian dictatorship in Cambodia. Laos was united more with the Soviet Union. And Vietnam initially was allied more with China, but as time went on, they were allied more with the Soviet Union. In fact, it's actually going to be Vietnam that's going to invade Cambodia to remove the Khmer Rouge from power. Vietnam removes the Khmer Rouge, the Chinese-backed communists, and then China actually responds by invading Vietnam, and then Vietnam actually defeats China in 1979. So Vietnam has the honor of saying they defeated the Japanese in World War II, the French in the 1950s, America in the 60s and 70s, and then China as well. And when we look at Southeast Asia as a whole, domino theory was only partially true. Domino theory was true of Vietnam and of Laos and Cambodia and of Indochina more broadly, the Indochina region, but it wasn't true of all of Southeast Asia. Communist governments did not take control of the Philippines or of Thailand or of Myanmar or what is often called Malaya. And there's reasons for this. The first reason is communism is successful when it can be linked with nationalism, and it becomes especially successful when it can be linked with anti-colonialism, when communists are able to promise liberation not only from capitalism but from former colonizing powers, as was done in Indochina against the French, and nationalism against the invading Japanese. So communism plus nationalism plus anti-colonialism can be very, very potent. Also, communist countries, when they take over, they are getting support from the Soviet Union and from the PRC from China. Though those support from those countries does play a major, and I would say a central role in the success of communist movements. It's not entirely domestic. The thing is, though, when communism is associated with a foreign power, it's not nearly as successful. In places like Malaya, for example, communism was not associated with nationalism. It was associated with Chinese influence, with foreign influence, and so communism did not take off in Malaya. By the way, Malaya was a former British colony as well. It didn't have the anti-colonialist and nationalist edge there either. Additionally, when it comes to material support from other communist countries, you see that the communist countries, they don't project power as well over water as they do over land. This is largely because the navies of Russia and China were not nearly as powerful as the navies of the capitalist countries like the United States or like Britain before the U.S. So you're not going to see successful communist insurgencies in places like the Philippines or in Indonesia, for example. The communist powers of China and Russia just cannot support insurgencies in those countries the way they can in a place like Indochina, in Vietnam. They can move through Laos and Cambodia to support Vietnam. I also think this is part of the reason why the anti-communist forces, the UN in South Korea, in the Korean Peninsula, and the British in Malaya, why they were able to be more successful. These are peninsulas, so there's fewer routes into these regions for communist forces. In North Korea, you have to move down North Korea into South Korea. It's a much more difficult route than moving through other countries down into South Vietnam. Same thing on the Malaya Peninsula as well. So it's a combination of geography, an inability or a difficulty with projecting power over water, and then when you mix nationalism and anti-colonialism with communism, you get more successful communist revolutions. And I don't say this as a supporter of communism. I'm certainly not. I say this as a historian looking at domino theory, looking at geography, looking at military concerns across the world, and trying to understand why communism was able to take root and take over some countries and why it was not able to take over others. The 1970s saw very controversial U.S. foreign policy maneuvers in the Middle East as well. The United States supported Israel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War and really had been becoming more supportive of Israel for many years before 1973. But the United States' support of Israel in 1973 by sending them weapons and supplies and things like that. It led the Arab oil-producing nations of OPEC to begin an embargo against the United States and other Western nations like Great Britain and like the Netherlands. This led to drastic increases in oil prices. Oil went from being about $2.90 a barrel to about $11.65 a barrel, so it increased by 4 times. And the oil prices are going to remain very high for the rest of the decade, even after the embargo ends in 1974. And the embargo ended in 1974, and the petrodollar was established in 74 as well. The U.S. dollar would be used to buy and sell oil, and in exchange, the nation of Saudi Arabia would have a increased trading relationship, particularly a weapons trading relationship with the United States. And the petrodollar helped to stabilize the American currency, which after the early 1970s was no longer backed by gold or any other precious metal. And the U.S. wanted to support Israel to keep the Soviet Union from gaining footholds in this oil-rich part of the world. But doing so, in many ways, turned many Arab states against the United States. And it also, in some ways, led to the creation of organizations like the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and other Palestinian organizations that might be considered terrorist groups. And some of these groups engaged in attacks against Jewish people around the world, like at the 1972 Munich Olympics, and Israeli forces often responded very aggressively to these attacks. Further to the east, in Central Asia, the U.S. looked to prevent the expansion of Soviet power as well. This was an area that had become a power vacuum in the late 1940s and early 1950s as India gained its independence a little bit further to the south and east, and Iran was an important area of conflict as well. Iran is essentially, or was essentially, trapped for many years between the British in India and the Russians to their north. The British have now left India, but the Soviet Union remains a serious player for the north. During World War II, Iran was a neutral power, but in some ways they actually leaned towards the Axis because they had many reasons to not trust the Soviet Union and to not trust the British in India. After the war, though, there was concern that Iran was beginning to gravitate towards its neighbors to the north, that is, towards the Soviet Union. And you see this with the election of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who was democratically elected in 1953. He was a left-leaning leader, a nationalistic leader. Experts that I've talked to on the subject have described him as being socialist-leaning but not a communist, and it was said that there were communist agents in his government. And there was fear, and not without reason, that his government was going to be too close with the Soviet Union. But the real point of contention against Mossadegh, though, was his nationalization of the Iranian oil industry, especially of British oil holdings in Iran. And the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry led the British intelligence MI6, along with the CIA to orchestrate Operation Ajax, in which Mossadegh was removed from power, and in his place, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Pahlavi, was installed. And the Shah of Iran, he was pro-Western and supported many liberal reforms of the country, but he became increasingly autocratic and authoritarian as time went on. He ruled with an iron fist, and even as he promised to secularize and liberalize the country. Some did welcome the Shah's rule in the beginning, but over time the Iranian people would turn against him. And there's many reasons for why this is. His attempts to secularize the country led to suppression of certain types of speech, particularly the sermons of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who was a very popular religious cleric for Shia or Shiite Islam in Iran. Eventually, the Ayatollah actually had to flee the country, and his recordings and speeches and sermons were banned. They were listened to and became very popular, but they were black market items. And when you make something banned, you make it taboo, and in some ways you actually make it cooler and more popular. But during the 1970s, the Shah of Iran wasn't a U.S. ally, and while he did oversee price increases, he continued to sell oil to the United States and to other Western nations, which led Iran to become very wealthy and to become flooded with foreign currency. And this had some temporary benefits, but instead it caused massive inflation of the Iranian currency, just because there's so much more money being pumped into the country, and that's going to lead actually to a depression by the end of the 1970s. What goes up must come down. The bubble popped, and these economic privations combined with what you might call censorship of certain types of speech, an authoritarian government, and also the Shah of Iran, and particularly his wife, did not do a very good job curating their image. They made expensive renovations to their palace. They took elaborate vacations, even as everyday Iranians were suffering during this serious economic recession. And this causes the Islamic Revolution to begin in 1978. There's a massive uprising that combines many revolutionary left-leaning ideas with very traditional Shiite Islamic ideas as well. Ideologies that often would not mix very well, but they were brought together by nationalism, by a bit of anti-colonialism as well, anti-foreign influence, and then of course anti-Shah influence, anti-authoritarian influence, and a new Islamic theocratic government is installed. And this government itself, also this new Islamic government, is very authoritarian, and non-Muslims, non-Shiite Muslims can face very serious threats to their freedoms, to their human rights. The rights of women are drastically curtailed in the country as well in the wake of the 1978 Islamic Revolution. And I should add that when the Islamic Revolution took place, it had mass public support. When the Shah left the country, Khomeini was elected in a popular referendum, and they turned Iran into an Islamic theocratic republic. So this was not just coming out of nowhere. This had broad support from the Iranian people at the time. And the collapse of the Shah's regime, his flight from the country, and the transformation of Iran into a fundamentalist Islamic Shiite Muslim state is only going to further complicate U.S. foreign policy interests in the Middle East and in Central Asia. And those are issues that are still a challenge today. Now we'll turn our attention to Latin America, U.S.-Latin American relations in the 1970s. The 1970s was a continuation of earlier Cold War foreign policy. While there was détente against the Soviet Union, there were a warming of relations between China and the United States. The U.S. will continue its interventions in Latin America to prevent the spread of communism, even if doing so means partnering with authoritarian leaders. Domino theory, the idea that if one country fell to communism, an entire region or continent could fall to communism, that was still being applied in Latin America. America had failed to defeat communist Cuba during the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and Cuba had also worked to try to spread communism to other Latin American countries. Um, in some ways, U.S. Latin American policy during the Cold War, whether it's the 50s, whether it's the 60s, whether it's the 70s, it harkens back to the old Roosevelt corollary in the early 1900s, which I've talked about in previous lectures. The U.S. had a right, even a mandate, to lead and intervene in Latin American nations, and now we're doing it for the sake of anti-communism, as opposed to keep Europe out or to protect American business interests. And sometimes we are still protecting American business interests, but now it's being done to stop authoritarian communism, even if it means supporting authoritarian right-wing movements and leaders. And South America had become a hotbed of unrest by the 1970s as several governments had fallen to military coups back in the 1960s. Chile, in particular, was a contentious area. Chile is a country that's actually fairly wealthy. It has a lot of environmental and natural resources, particularly copper mines, and politics in the country have been moving to the political left. Their head of state, Salvador Allende, he promised to transform Chile into a socialist state, and he was having friendlier relations with Fidel Castro in Cuba, and he had received support from the Soviet Union as well. I should add also that Chile is not a two-party state like the United States. It's a multi-party state that has more of a parliamentary electoral system, and Allende had been the most popular candidate. He'd won with a plurality of the vote, but he only had about 28.5% of the total vote. So he did not have the majority of the government, but he had been the most popular candidate. That's partially going to lead to why he's going to be removed from power. And Allende's socialistic policies, I would argue, and many would agree with me, they led to a recession in the country, and strikes became more common as people began to turn against him as leader. And there was also evidence that Allende was becoming more authoritarian himself, suppressing his political opponents, trying to force people to go back to work to keep the economy from collapsing. On this backdrop, the Chilean military began a coup, and with the assistance of Brazil and the United States as well, that the Chilean military is going to take over the country by 1973. Allende will commit suicide, and General Augusto Pinochet, who you see on the right-hand side of this slide, he will be the new leader of the country. Pinochet ruled as a dictator and suppressed socialist dissidents and communists in his country. He also fostered very close relationships with the U.S. as well. While the U.S. had worked to keep Chile from becoming communist, it had helped to dissolve a somewhat democratic government, a government that was becoming more authoritarian over time, but they had replaced it with a authoritarian dictatorship. I should also add, though, that even though Pinochet did suppress socialists and communists, including having executions, the absolute number of executions that took place in Chile under Pinochet were much lower than what took place in Cuba, for example, under Castro. I'm not saying that these suppressions or executions were right in any stretch of the imagination, but scale is important when you talk about this sort of thing. In 1980, Pinochet held a plebiscite in which he was democratically elected president, and Chile did see significant economic growth in the early 1980s as the nation became more open with foreign trade and as it adopted free market economic principles. In 1989, Pinochet failed to win re-election, and he peacefully stepped down from power in 1990, bringing an end to the military dictatorship. Despite this, however, the U.S.'s support of Pinochet would set a precedent for continued interventions in Latin America, often to support authoritarian regimes that would be friendly with America but hostile to communism. And you really see this with what is called Operation Condor, which began in 1975, so 2 years after the Pinochet's coup in Chile. 1975 into the 1980s is Operation Condor. Now, we're back in the United States. Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency in 1974, leaving his VP, Gerald Ford, to continue his term. And one of the first things that Ford did was pardon Nixon for his alleged crimes. And that was a very controversial decision. Nixon's opponents and many Democrats, most notably Senator Ted Kennedy, condemned Ford's decision to pardon Nixon. Ford, however, was not trying to cover for Nixon as much as he was just trying to help America get over the traumatic experience of Watergate. He promised the American people our long national nightmare is over, and the belief later on was that by offering Nixon a pardon, which Nixon did accept, essentially Nixon was admitting fault for Watergate, admitting guilt. An innocent person doesn't need to accept a pardon. Anyway, though, it was a controversial move. And Ford is going to serve out the rest of Nixon's presidency, and he's going to run for president in 1976. He will be chosen by the Republican Party to be their nominee. They also considered Ronald Reagan, former governor of California, as well. And Ford is going to run on his political experience, the fact that he's already president, and he's going to try to cast himself as an urbane, principled politician who would not stoop to the lows of his predecessor, Nixon. Ford also took a more passive Rose Garden strategy, it was called, giving speeches and addresses from the Rose Garden of the White House, because he's already president, so traveling around the country for campaigning is going to be more difficult. And also, you need to be a bit more demure, you need to be a bit more low-key in the post-Watergate era. Also, I should point out that President Ford had a couple of accidents while he was walking around. He once stumbled and bumped his head while he was on a train in Michigan. Another time he fell down the stairs of Air Force One as well. And of course, the media had a field day with these incidents. Saturday Night Live, Chevy Chase made a caricature really of Ford, who was constantly tripping and falling and just acting in kind of a buffoonish manner, which is actually kind of sad because Gerald Ford was actually he'd been a very, very competitive athlete in college. He'd played for the University of Michigan back in the 1930s and had been on the team when they were undefeated. Michigan fans always love to remind Ohio State graduates like me about those seasons back in the 30s. And many people who are, experts on sports say that Ford was good enough to play football professionally, but he chose to go to law school instead, which eventually led him to getting into politics. So in some ways, it was kind of unfair to mock him as this clumsy, accident-prone oaf. Although the skits with Chevy Chase are very funny. I definitely recommend checking them out if you like physical slapstick kind of comedy. And Ford is going to run against Jimmy Carter, the Democratic governor of Georgia. And Carter was able to define himself as being the opposite of Ford and the opposite of Nixon. He had comparatively limited political experience. In particular, his experience with national politics was limited. He was a Georgia politician, but that wasn't a shortcoming in this election in '76. If anything, that was an advantage, being a political outsider. In terms of politics, Carter was generally a moderate, walking the line between liberal and conservative. He was liberal on a lot of foreign policy issues, but then on a lot of domestic economic issues, he was actually more conservative. And I'll get into his political stances later in this video. He was also a white man from the South with a rather strong Southern accent. You would immediately recognize this upon hearing him speak. And he was also a very outspoken evangelical Christian as well. this was a good thing. This helped him resonate with white Southerners, even though he did support many more liberal issues, and he was a supporter of civil rights. White Southerners felt more comfortable voting for Carter than they would have felt voting for other more liberal Democrats, like say Ted Kennedy, for example. And Carter being outspokenly religious, that's a good thing after Watergate. Nixon was not very religious. He was a Quaker. Quakers have ideas that are quite different from more traditionalist Christians, and certainly ethical issues were a major issue with Nixon. So the American people want someone who's religious, who's going to be honest, and who's going to be forthright. You might say that Carter was a little too forthright. He was actually interviewed by Playboy magazine, and he confessed to Playboy magazine that he occasionally had immoral thoughts about other women other than his wife. The kind of thing that, why would you admit that? That's a religious thing to confess to something like that, but it's a rather odd thing for people who are less religious. But Carter's religious beliefs, though, also were important because the evangelical religious right is on the rise in the 1970s, and they're going to want to vote for candidates that share their religious beliefs. In the end, Carter wins the 1976 election resoundingly. He gets 297 electoral votes, and he gets 50.1% of the popular vote, whereas Ford only had 240 electoral votes and about 48% of the popular vote. Carter will win all of the southern states except for Virginia, really testifying how he was actually able to build a coalition of disparate, often hostile voting blocs: blue-collar whites, Southern conservatives, especially white Southern conservatives, evangelical Christians, and African Americans. Once elected president, Carter worked to mitigate the problems that the nation was facing as a result of inflation, the oil crisis, and economic stagnation. It's often called stagflation. It's a portmanteau of inflation and stagnation. Carter will help to create the DOE, the Department of Energy, which will work to conserve scarce fuel resources. And he's also going to help get other additional environmental legislation passed. And he had solar panels placed on the roof of the White House. Oil prices, even after the embargo, they remain very high throughout the 1970s. They're about 4 times what they were before the big embargo of 73 to 74. And organizations like the Department of Energy, they appeal to both liberals and conservatives. Liberals will like the Department of Energy's focus on renewable resources, renewable energy, solar, hydro, wind power, nuclear power. I mean, nuclear power has become more controversial in recent years. And certainly hydropower and wind power and solar power are really not as green as you might think. There are environmental problems that come when you dam rivers. Windmills can hurt migratory bird flocks as they fly through the air, and solar panels can also make the ground very hot and act as massive heat sinks, but they do lower your carbon footprint. The Department of Energy, though, to appeal to conservatives, also investigated increased domestic oil production, something that many more conservative-leaning people will support. And to go deeper into the economic front, Carter witnessed increased inflation and slow economic recovery after the economic recessions of the early 1970s. American workers found their wages were not going up in proportion with inflation, which is unfortunately always the case, and this is the era of slow economic growth. It's the era of stagflation. And, Carter is increasing regulation in some areas of the economy. He's also calling for decreased regulation in others. There's several examples of this. One of the most notable examples is the deregulation of the airline industry, which ultimately led to air travel being cheaper and more common for everyday Americans. Airlines could fly more flights. There were more aircraft in the sky. Airlines could put more seats onto their aircraft so they could sell more tickets. And by selling more tickets, they're able to lower the price of air travel. And really, before the 1970s, everyday middle-class Americans did not travel by plane very frequently. People who traveled by plane frequently were diplomats, people who did international business. For a vacation, you usually would not take a flight. You would load up your car. That's going to change with the Carter administration and with the deregulation of the airline industry, which, on the whole, I do see as a net positive. It's good for the economy. It makes air travel more affordable. You wouldn't have, for better or for worse, airlines like Spirit if the airline industry remained regulated. On the negative side, though, flying becomes more uncomfortable. The seats are smaller. The service that you receive from flight attendants is going to be of lower quality. They were called stewards and stewardesses back then because they still used more gendered language in those days. Carter also supported the deregulation of the trucking industry and the beer industry as well. So if you like craft beer, you can thank Jimmy Carter and the deregulation of the craft beer industry, because before the 1970s, if you wanted to have craft beer, you basically had to make it yourself. Maybe you could buy from a local brewery, but that local brewery could not export their beer to other states or to other parts of the country. That was something that was left up to Anheuser-Busch and Miller and the big beer companies. So that made a more competitive market that led to craft beer becoming a popular and viable commodity in the United States. And for trucking, this was done in the 1970s because there were plans to lower shipping prices to help combat the inflation of groceries and of consumer goods and things of that nature. And by deregulating the trucking industry, allowing truckers to pull more loads, to work longer hours, you could lower the price of goods. And in goods prices, consumer goods prices do lower as time goes on, although whether it was because of trucking being deregulated or it was because of foreign trade, that's a more debatable subject. And some have suggested that the deregulation of the trucking industry led to trucking becoming not nearly as profitable of an industry for actual truck drivers who had to work basically longer hours for lower pay, but it was part of the Carter administration's attempt to open up the economy and make it more competitive to try to help the economy grow so we could get out of the era of stagflation. And again, these are issues that in some ways are actually more conservative, although Carter has a more liberal reputation. And on the whole, I would say, in terms of social issues, especially 1970s social issues, Carter was a more liberal politician. On the controversial issue of abortion, Carter chose to uphold Roe versus Wade. I'll talk more about Roe versus Wade later in this video when I get to Supreme Court cases. Most evangelical Christians opposed abortion, but Carter himself was an evangelical Christian. His stance was that he did not personally agree with abortion, but he did not think that it was his position as president to undermine the Supreme Court's decision. Instead, he believed that we ought to instead support programs that would fight poverty and thus prevent abortions. And so I would say that Carter on domestic issues was pretty balanced, probably leaned a little bit more to the left, especially when you add in social issues like abortion, but he did support issues like deregulation, increased domestic oil production, things that conservatives would support as well. Carter also supported the other DOE, the Department of Education, was created in 1979, which in recent years has become very controversial. The creation of the Department of Education, though, I would definitely class that as a more liberal piece of domestic legislation that Carter supported. On the whole, I would say Carter gains his liberal reputation more for his foreign policy decisions. He's going to continue the strategy of détente against the Soviet Union, and he's really going to try to reverse some of the more aggressive elements of U.S. foreign policy. The idea is this is a gesture of good faith to the Soviets, and it will help to bring calm to international affairs. President Nixon, Richard Nixon, While he did support détente with the Soviet Union, Nixon believed in what was called chaos or madmen theory, and that if he did things that were unexpected, some might say irrational, his opponents would not know how to respond, and that would give the United States an advantage. Uh, Carter did not try that. He did continue détente, but he wanted to do it in a much more transparent way that he thought would invite transparency and openness from our opponents, especially the Soviet Union. And we can discuss how effective that was in a moment. But he tried to arrange deals between the Soviet Union and the U.S. to ban nuclear testing and to slow the nuclear arms race between the two countries, which this arms race has become very costly. America needs to save money to deal with its foundering domestic economy. He also will push for reductions in nuclear weapons as well, as seen during the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT II. And I would argue, as a historian, that SALT II, which was negotiated between Carter and Leonid Brezhnev of the Soviet Union, that this was a treaty that really benefited the Soviets more than it benefited the U.S. because in the 1970s, because the Soviet economy was weaker than the U.S. economy, they really focused on making fewer but better quality, faster and harder to intercept missiles, nuclear missiles. Their plan were essentially to create silo buster missiles. These missiles would target our nuclear silos, and basically they would destroy our nukes before our nukes could even be launched. So limiting arms, the U.S. limiting its arms, the Soviet limiting its arms, that benefits the Soviets because the Soviets are focusing more on fewer but higher quality weapons. And critics of Carter would suggest that his more open stance to the Soviet Union enabled our enemies. They would point to SALT II. They would point to the Panama Canal being returned to Panama. By the way, Panama actually had a left-wing authoritarian government at the time, not a right-wing authoritarian government. Yet Carter made a plan to have the canal be signed over to Panama by 1999. That this openness, some would say it looked like weakness to our opponents, that it enabled the Islamic Revolution of 1978, that it enabled the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as well. The Soviets will invade Afghanistan in 1978, the same year of the Iranian Revolution. Once that war began, though, Carter began to take a harder line in his foreign policy. He called for sanctions and things of that nature and embargoes against the Soviet Union, and Carter began to supply arms, weapons to Afghan insurgents called the Mujahideen, who were fighting against the Soviet invasion of their country. Carter will also withdraw the United States from the 1980 Olympics as a way of protesting the Soviets' intervention or war in Afghanistan, which was a very controversial move for many, particularly for many Olympic athletes. I've talked to one of my colleagues. Her wife actually was an Olympic athlete in volleyball, I believe, and she was all set to perform to compete in the 1980 Olympics, but then wasn't able to do so because of the Carter administration's decision to remove the United States from the games. And while taken on the whole, this doesn't sound like very good foreign policy. It sounds like a series of foreign policy failures. There were some successes for Carter in foreign policy, most notably the Camp David Accords of 1978, in which Carter met with the Prime Minister of Israel, and he met with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat as well, and he was able to negotiate a peace treaty between those two countries that had been bitter enemies for many years, and that's the Camp David Accords. And Egypt recognized Israel as a nation state as a part of the Accords, and then other Arab states would follow Egypt's lead in recognizing Israel. So it would have long-term significance as well. And to make an even greater achievement for Carter, Anwar Sadat had essentially been a Nazi collaborator during World War II, working with German agents against the British. So to have a Jewish leader and an Arab leader who had worked with the Nazis coming together in peace is very significant. So let it not be said that I don't give Carter credit where it's due. But liberals would support Carter. They would say that while there were missteps in his foreign policy, he was taking the United States in a more open and transparent direction politically, which was much needed after decades of subterfuge earlier in the Cold War. Conservatives would criticize Carter's foreign policy. They would say his transparency was not met with transparency, but that it was interpreted as weakness by our opponents. And the event that's the most controversial with the Carter presidency, particularly with his foreign policy, was his handling of the Iranian hostage crisis. On November 4th, 1979, student revolutionaries attacked and took control of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They captured 52 U.S. citizens and held them hostage for more than a year. And during this period, the hostages were subject to very harsh mistreatment, including things like mock executions. And it was a time of great fear and stress for the hostages and for the American people who nightly would have reports about the hostages and about how many days they'd been held in captivity by Iran. And the reason Carter is often criticized for the hostage crisis is not just because of his alleged or perceived weakness on the foreign policy front, but the U.S. Embassy had been kept open by the Carter administration. The safest thing to do would have been to close the embassy when the Iranian Revolution began. But doing that would have been a more aggressive and provocative measure. Essentially, we would have been saying that Iran is our enemy now by closing our embassy. What really angered the Iranian revolutionaries beyond their general anger with the United States was the Carter administration allowing the former Shah of Iran to come to the United States for medical treatment. That was kind of the spark for the powder keg that led to the Iranian hostage crisis. Carter authorized rescue missions to try to get the hostages liberated. Most notably Operation Eagle Claw, in which helicopters were going to be used by the U.S. military to infiltrate Iran, to fly in and then liberate the hostages. It was a pretty crazy plan, but they encountered bad weather, sandstorms, and they had mechanical failures, and these helicopters crashed, and several American servicemen, 8 to be exact, were killed. The helicopters were used by the Iranians as a propaganda tool that they had defeated the United States, the Great Satan, and it really just made the U.S. look worse. There was also a successful rescue attempt that was authorized by the Carter administration as well, of some American diplomats that had actually escaped from the U.S. Embassy. They were actually hiding out with the Canadians, and that actually went on to form the basis of the movie Argo, which came out about 15 or so years ago. The thing is, though, the American people didn't always know about what was going on behind the scenes. They didn't know what Carter was up to. If you want to criticize Carter, not so much his policies, but his leadership style, he was a massive micromanager. He had to be involved in every single little thing. He was not a good delegator. And because of this, during the hostage crisis, he was so busy working behind the scenes that he made fewer public appearances. And to the appearances of everyday Americans, he seemed out of his depth, like he could not control the situation, like he didn't care enough and was too inept to handle things. But as I said, he did authorize Operation Eagle Claw, which failed. He also authorized economic sanctions against Iran in early 1980. And at the same time, though, the American hostages are going to remain in Iranian captivity for over a year. And critics of Carter, especially Ronald Reagan, the 1980 Republican presidential candidate, they're going to argue that Carter was doing too little to free the hostages, and Reagan made a promise to the American people that he would release the hostages if he was elected president during his 1980 presidential run. Scholars who have studied Carter's presidency have argued that while Carter was a very principled man who fought for the issues he cared about, he was not a good politician. As I mentioned before, he micromanaged the activities of his cabinet members and refused to make deals with his domestic rivals, even as he was trying to reach out to America's foreign adversaries. He also argued with and mistreated his supporters in the Democratic Party, alienating him from the people who had helped him get elected. Again, he was often very unbending in his principles. And on the domestic front, Carter came off as weak and unable to fix U.S. economic problems the country was facing. And presidential historians have said that he was the last American president to ask everyday Americans to really sacrifice and to put up the challenges that they were dealing with at the time, and that was just a message that Americans no longer wanted to hear by the late 1970s. America had become so fractured. The last thing they wanted was the president telling them to sacrifice, telling them to, if you're cold, don't turn up the heat, put on a cardigan sweater instead. Also, when Carter put on his cardigan sweater, he looks a little bit like Mr. Rogers. He's also taking a shot at Nixon, who was always dressed to the nines as well. He was trying to be the anti-Nixon, the anti-imperial president. And basically, his opponents were upset with him, and many of his supporters were upset with him, feeling that he kind of reneged on his campaign promises. And then Carter, being a very principled man and often perhaps saying more than he should, his speeches were often misunderstood and misinterpreted as well. In his most infamous speech, which was given on July 5th, 1979, he described a crisis of confidence, or crisis of confidence, as Carter himself would have said with his Georgia drawl. And many Americans watched the speech, and they felt that Carter was describing a malaise that had engulfed the country. Although Carter never actually used the term malaise, this crisis of confidence speech is often called the malaise speech. And here Carter was asking the Americans to sacrifice more, to give up their mistaken idea of freedom, as he would call it. And the idea was it was maybe a true message, but it was more than a president should say, and it really rubbed a lot of Americans the wrong way. They were still dealing with very expensive gas prices. They were dealing with a struggling economy. And it probably was not the thing that everyday Americans wanted or needed to hear. And it will ultimately contribute to Carter losing his re-election campaign to Ronald Reagan in 1980. While many Americans disliked Carter's crisis of confidence speech, he had perfectly captured the mood of everyday Americans in the 1970s. Americans of all races and backgrounds were becoming pessimistic about the future, and not without reason. Many African Americans felt that their community's activism was faltering, and that African Americans were continuing to struggle in America, and that American society as a whole had abandoned them. And that led some African Americans to embrace black power in the early 1970s. White Americans from all political perspectives also struggled to deal with the changing American society. Supporters of counterculture and liberalism thought that the U.S. had not done enough to change its political and social structures, alienating many from mainstream political parties. I would also add that counterculture did achieve many of its goals, particularly when it came to changes to gender relations, changes to sexual mores, even changes to fashion and things like that. It's just, as those changes become bigger, they become a part of the dominant American culture, and they no longer feel counterculture. So in some ways, counterculture was really defeated by itself. It became a victim of its own success, even as it did have some areas where it did not achieve all of its goals. And Americans are observing urban decay as jobs are drying up in factories, jobs are moving offshore, and that's leaving behind blighted urban areas. When the factory shuts down, service economy jobs also shut down. Buildings are abandoned, trash piles up. Also, environmental pollution was a major problem in the 1970s, giving rise to the EPA, giving rise to smog regulations, giving rise to CAFE standards. There were corporate average fuel economy that was designed to make more fuel efficient cars. In many cases, the CAFE laws were exploited by American automakers. Basically, what they would do is they would just make trucks instead of cars because trucks had looser requirements. You want to know why SUVs and trucks got to be more popular after the 1970s? It's largely because of CAFE standards. Essentially, what was designed to protect the environment and protect scarce, expensive fuel actually backfired and in some ways actually made things worse. In the 1970s, they even had things like speed limits being nationally regulated to 55 miles an hour. And as you can imagine, that was a very unpopular move. People broke speed limit laws. They would use CB radios to talk to other cars or to talk to truckers. They would ask, are there police ahead? Are there smokies, as they were called in the 1970s, ahead, and if there weren't any, then you would drive faster. And this is before radar guns were invented, so it was easier to slow down if you saw a police car. Basically, what the police do is, in the 70s, they would have to hide, and then they would drive out in their car that's easily marked unless it's undercover, and you would see them following you, and then you would slow down. It was really only if you continue driving fast, they would match your speed with their speedometer, and then they would pull you over. So it almost became like a national sport or a national pastime, breaking the 55 mile an hour speed limit laws. My grandfather, for example, had a CB radio that he would use in his Trans Am to talk to truckers. It was kind of like the movie Smokey and the Bandit that was based on, it's a fictional movie, but it was based on real things that were happening in the 70s. As I said, there's a lot of division in American society. There's breaking of social mores and taboos, and there's political fracture, there's social fracture. I mentioned African Americans before. White people, both working and middle class white people, many of whom had supported the Democratic Party in the past and its New Deal policies, they felt that the Democratic Party no longer cared about their economic issues. That it cared more about social issues and civil rights and things that just did not resonate with them. That it was doing too much to court minorities and kind of left-leaning wealthy elites in the East Coast. What were called at the time limousine liberals, which is a term that's still used today. And their feeling was that the party that they had supported for many years, the Democrats, it was becoming a party of ivory tower intellectuals and radicals and minorities. That it cared more about minorities and these kind of intellectual types than it did about them. And whether or not these sentiments were completely true, they do grow over time amongst white blue-collar workers, and many of them will defect to Nixon and the Republican Party in 1972, since Nixon was promising things like stability, law and order, and economic growth. Carter will get some of these voters back in 1976, but they're going to again many of them are going to vote for Reagan in 1980. So politics is changing, political systems are coming to an end. The 1960s and the 1970s are called a de-alignment period in American politics. The fifth party system, which began with the 1932 election and was the party system of the New Deal coalition, it's ending in the 1960s, and there's a de-alignment period that goes on in the 1960s and 1970s before the sixth party system begins in 1980. And the sixth party system goes from 1980, some would say to the present, some would say that it ended in 2016. And during this de-alignment period that is between the fifth and sixth party system, the South moves in a more Republican trajectory, thanks in part to Nixon's Southern strategy. And while some white working class people changed their allegiance for, some of them did change their allegiance for racist reasons because they didn't like civil rights, they didn't like desegregation. Many others did so because they just felt that the Democratic Party was radicalizing and weakening the country, and that the liberal part of the party had basically just taken over and was forcing everybody else out, and that it had gone beyond its New Deal goals of previous decades. So that New Deal coalition that I've talked about that began in the 1930s of working class whites, white liberals, African Americans, and white Southerners, it's really pretty much completely unraveled in the 1970s. And it's going to really continue falling apart and dividing into the 21st century as well. Here are some stats about deindustrialization. Deindustrialization was driven by a variety of factors. It was driven by neoliberal economics, which begins to emerge really as early as 1947 with the Taft-Hartley Act, but it continues in the 1970s. People often think of neoliberalism as being an 80s or 90s thing, but it begins much earlier. Jimmy Carter's deregulation was an element of neoliberal economics. But neoliberalism also accelerates because there is more industrial production moving out of the Northeast and out of the Midwest. It moves into the Sun Belt, the Southeast and the Southwest, where unions are weaker, and then in some cases it moves out of the country entirely. So you're going to notice that manufacturing jobs, for their share of the economy, they're going to decline throughout the 1970s. This area here on the chart. And of course, when these industrial jobs, these union protected jobs leave, other businesses will fold as well because the people of the town are now unemployed. They don't have the money to spend anymore. And this leads to general urban decay in many big cities and even in small towns in the Midwest. There's a reason the Midwest is called the Rust Belt, and it's because of factories moving out. To make matters worse, the factories that are staying behind are automating. There was a discussion of factory jobs as being what were called man-killing jobs. These jobs were dangerous, that they were boring and mind-numbing, and those things maybe are true in some ways, but they are jobs, and they were jobs that paid well. So things were automated, and that also leads to job losses as well. And as these factory jobs are going away, you're going to notice that people are going to leave the cities. In particular, you're going to find that a lot more white people are going to leave the cities. You're going to see white flight, increased white flight, as it's called, in the 1970s. And white flight will be driven by a variety of factors besides just deindustrialization. One factor that in some ways drives white flight, but is also in part caused by white flight, was busing of students. And busing was done in the 1970s. It started really as a national policy in 1971 after the Swann v. Charlotte case. That's Swann, like the bird swan with an extra N on it. And this was done to help African American students attend better funded, bigger schools with better facilities that were largely white, because you go to the school based on your school district where you live. Brown versus Board of Education had legally de jure ended school segregation, but segregation existed because white people and black people continued to live separately, and then white flight saw white people leaving areas as black people were moving in, or leaving areas that were more ethnically diverse to begin with. And busing was a contentious subject. Many white working class people who had previously voted for the Democratic Party became very angry with the Democrats over busing. Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts, a liberal Democratic politician, he addressed the white working class population of Boston, people who would have been solid voters for Democrats like him in the past, and they were angry. They shouted at him, they yelled at him, they even vandalized and damaged his old family home as a protest of busing. And while some parents who opposed busing, they did so for racist reasons. They did not want black kids in school with their white children. Others were just concerned that school sizes, class sizes were going to get larger, and it would mean fewer resources for their children. So there were people who opposed busing for racist reasons, as there were people who opposed it for non-racist reasons as well. And believe it or not, some African Americans opposed busing as well. They didn't want their kids going to school far, far away from where they lived. That was actually long commute times to school was part of what motivated the Brown versus Board of Education case back in the 50s. And a good example of this actually is Chris Rock, the very famous African American comedian. He lived in New York. He was bused as a child as well. And Chris Rock has said that he didn't like busing because he was one of the few black kids at a mostly white school that he was bused to, and he dealt with racist abuse from the people around him. And also, he didn't like being on the bus for hours and hours each day. It meant less time for homework, less time for family and friends, and less sleep, and that was making it harder for him to perform in school. But a lot of people from across the political perspective, across the political spectrum, whether it was white working class hard hats, as they were called because of the hats they wore, they opposed busing. Some did for racist reasons, some did for more non-racist reasons, but also many black people opposed busing as well. And some Democratic Party politicians, like Kennedy, had supported busing. Others, like future U.S. President Joe Biden actually criticized busing as well. He argued that it was a failure by the liberal wing of his party, and he said that the issue needed to be resolved. And if it wasn't resolved, then his children would end up in what he called a racial jungle. And when he said that, I don't believe that he was saying that he wasn't saying that black kids were specifically making schools racial jungles. He was saying the contentious issue of busing was turning schools into racial jungles. Either way, it's very indelicate language that we wouldn't use today. I want to talk about religious change in America in the 1970s because changes to Americans' spiritual and religious beliefs and religious customs, they are related to the rising social discontent of the 1970s. Um, to begin, I'll say that religious participation, particularly Christian religious participation in things like Christian religious services, it reaches a peak around World War II and shortly after in the early parts of the Cold War. And then in the 1960s, religious service attendance and traditional Christian religiosity declined pretty significantly in the 1960s, as you can see on this slide here. You'll notice, though, in the early 70s, things do continue to decline, but there's a slight uptick in the mid-1970s, and then it's, for the most part, down, down, down for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And some people like to bring up church attendance in colonial America and in America in the early national period, and they try to compare it with church attendance in the 20th century to say that declining church attendance is really not a big deal in the 20th century. And I see where they're coming from, but I disagree somewhat because after the 1920s, America is a primarily urban nation, and also after the 1920s, automobiles become accessible to average middle-class Americans, making traveling and driving to things like church services much easier. In colonial and revolutionary era America, the majority of the population was rural and lived across the frontier, and in some cases there simply were not enough people close enough together. There was not enough population density to have regular religious services. And so they had things like circuit riders who would ride into a town and preach one or two sermons per year, and the residents would not go to church otherwise. It didn't mean that they were less religious, it just accessibility was an issue. But in the 20th century, I do think declining church attendance is a pretty good barometer of declining religious participation. And even if you're not a religious person, seeing declining religious participation should be alarming to you. And the reason is because declining religious service participation. It usually correlates with declining civic engagement. It correlates with declining community involvement. People will volunteer less. They won't know their neighbors as well. They will become much more suspicious of the people around them. It's really not it's indicative and often goes along with other societal problems. And there's a lot of other studies that have been done of America in this period, like bowling alone, for example, a very famous study of bowling leagues and civic engagement and community involvement in this period that show that these things are often related and they're not good signs. The thing is, though, even as general participation does decline, spirituality is changing in other ways. Other religions are emerging in America and becoming more popular. Particularly Eastern religions take off in the 1960s, as I mentioned in a previous video, although the Eastern religions that are taking off in the 60s and 70s have been heavily modified to fit you might call it the standards and mores of Western culture. Some might say in a very disrespectful manner that's not fair to the original version of those Eastern religions. And I talked about this in my 1960s video, but what you see in the 1970s, and I think this is the slight uptick that you see amidst the downward trend, is the emergence of the religious right, or the evangelical Christian religious right. And this is a group of people that before the 1960s and 70s were very disparate and spread out into different communities across the country, and but they come together in the 60s and certainly by the 1970s for a few reasons. So the evangelical religious right, as it's called, it consists of a variety of people. In many ways, it's actually a very diverse movement. It's Protestant Christians, especially white Protestant Christians from a variety of parts of the country. I would say more of them will come from the South and the Midwest than from the Northeast. And it's going to include white Protestants from a variety of denominations and sects. And what brings them together is a belief in evangelism, that Christianity must grow as a religion and you must proselytize or get people to convert to Christianity. That's what evangelism means in the context of Christianity. There's also a group called the fundamentalists who also agree with the evangelicals on other issues. They believe in evangelism, and they also believe in traditional Christian morality. They believe that the Bible is a moral code in addition to a religious text. And you also have the traditionalists as well, or Orthodox Christians. I don't mean like Greek Orthodox or like that religious organization, that religion. I mean people who have a traditionalist view of the Bible, that believe in what is called the inerrancy of the Bible, that the events described in the Bible, even the supernatural events, that they actually took place, and that you should live by those. So the evangelicals, the fundamentalists, and the traditionalists or Orthodox of a variety of Protestant groups, they may disagree on some elements of Christianity, like what type of baptism is best, whether you should drink alcohol or not. They come together over their agreement on moral issues, that people ought to follow Christian morality, and that they ought to vote those values as well. At the same time, these white Protestants, mostly white Protestants, you don't see as many non-white people joining the religious right. They will begin to get friendlier with Catholics as well, especially white Catholics. And previously to the 1960s and 70s, and really even as late as 1960, there was still some animosity between American Protestants and Catholics. There were people that said they were not going to vote for John F. Kennedy because he was a Catholic, and they felt uncomfortable doing so as Protestants. But you see that more traditionalist Catholics, they're going to become friendlier with these traditionalist, fundamentalist, evangelical Protestants, and they're going to form the evangelical religious right, which is going to become a very powerful voting bloc in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, really into the 21st century. They're still around as a voter bloc today, but they're not as powerful of a voter bloc. And the reason that these disparate groups come together, these Catholic groups and these Protestant groups, is they're concerned about social developments, particularly a couple of Supreme Court cases. Engel v. Vitale in the 1960s, which saw public prayer be banned from public schools. And it was essentially a non-denominational Judeo-Christian prayer that was banned. They're concerned that the country is moving in a less Christian direction. That's going to be bad for the country's morality. And then in the 1970s, especially after 1973, you have the Roe versus Wade case, which abortion was a contentious issue for religious voters, and it's only going to become more contentious after Roe versus Wade in 1973. And these religious right people, whether they are white evangelical Protestants or more traditionalists, usually white Catholics, they're going to form as an important part of the conservative movement or the conservative coalition, really what I would call the modern late 20th century, early 21st century conservative movement. And of course, as the religious right's power in politics has increased, as it's waxed and waned, conservatism also changes its face as well. And I'll talk a bit more about conservatism on the next slide. And here are some figures in modern American conservatism, including William F. Buckley Jr. in the center, standing next to Ronald Reagan, another very important modern American conservative leader. And on the right-hand side, you also have American evangelist Billy Graham. Billy Graham had supported civil rights in the 1960s, but he will go on to become a leader of conservatism in the 1970s because of conservatism's significant religious right, evangelical religious right membership. And I mention Graham's support for civil rights because some opponents of the religious right and of this late 20th century conservatism, they suggest that this was a group of racist people who kept their racist beliefs hidden behind their religious beliefs. And while perhaps that may be true for some people, others were not racist at all, but they were very concerned about abortion. They were concerned about perceived moral decline in the country, and that was why they came together to form the religious right and then to form the modern American conservative movement. But politics is always changing. What it means to be a conservative in the late 1970s is very different than what it meant to be a conservative in the early 21st century. And what it means to be a conservative in the 2020s is certainly quite different as well. So there are other social movements that are continuing in the 1970s, most notably the feminist movement and the beginnings of the gay rights movement, or what we might call the LGBT movement today. And inspired by the successes of the civil rights movement, a new generation of feminists called the second wave of feminism. They will fight for things like equal pay for women, equal access to funds and facilities for female college students, and what is called Title IX, and they'll fight for increased reproductive rights, especially when it comes to things like contraception and abortion. And the second wave feminist movement was, in large part, had its genesis with the 1963 work, The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan was a woman who had worked in journalism, and she'd had children, and she felt pressured to leave the workforce by her male bosses and by her husband at the time. That led her to write a book that was very critical of middle class American womanhood, that it was shallow and it was consumeristic and that it was not intellectually stimulating. And that work became very popular, and it in some ways led to the growth of the second wave feminist movement that also fought for things like equal pay for women, to encourage more women to work outside of the home. That paying women less money for the same job was a violation of their equal protection under the law, and that led to national laws that made it illegal to discriminate against a person and pay them less for the same work. And across the 1970s, the number of households that have two incomes will increase drastically. In some ways, it was because it made more sense now to have both in a heterosexual relationship, both the husband and the wife, the mother and the father, both working outside of the home, because women can make more money now and they have more opportunities to work outside of the home. And having two people working can better deal with the economic problems that everyday Americans were struggling with in the 1970s. At the same time, though, there are some challenges that come with switching to a dual income model for your household, for your family. If only one person is working outside of the home, because there's still a lot of very important work that's being done inside the home. Suddenly you need things like 2 cars now. You have to buy more clothing as well. If you have both parents working outside of the home, you need to have more business attire, which is more expensive than the more casual clothing you might wear around the house. You eat out more, for example, when you're both working. Both the husband and the wife, the mother and the father are working. There's less time for domestic chores and tasks, which many women reported that, yes, they were working now, making money for themselves, but they were still doing the majority of the domestic work. Their husbands, their spouses were not helping more around the house so that they could work more. And of course, if two people are now working outside the home being paid wages, this means that there's more tax revenue that can be collected as well. And I'm not saying that there was a conspiracy theory here. People sometimes suggest that the second wave feminist movement was a conspiracy to enslave the American population and to get more tax money out of us. They point to Gloria Steinem, for example. They point to Steinem, who was an important feminist activist. They suggest that she had ties to the CIA, which, from what I've seen, they were very indirect ties. There was a youth organization that she was part of that was connected to the CIA. She was not a CIA agent that I've seen. And within the feminist movement, there's different factions as well. There are some that just want to fight for legal equality. There are others that are more radical, that really want to focus on protesting social norms that they see as oppressing women, what they call the patriarchy, and that group is a lot more radical. And I should add as well that there is what is called black feminism, led by people like Angela Davis. It was focused on very different issues. It was focused on many civil rights issues and African American issues, which Davis and her supporters felt like were not as relevant to black women, who were less likely to be in college and to benefit from Title IX the way white women were. So there are certain divisions within the feminist movement, and the movement did have some male support, but you'll find from polls the majority of men will oppose the movement, and many women as well will oppose the feminist movement as well. Particularly conservative women, they'll argue that the feminist movement had become an impediment and even a threat to traditional womanhood and motherhood. And many working class women will find the movement was too academic, too upper middle class, and more focused on the desires of elite, white collar, college attending women. That the reforms they're calling for are not really helping women who are working in jobs like teaching or nursing, what are often called pink collar jobs that are kind of between white collar and blue collar, and that they require physical labor, but also mental labor, and also often are done more by women, and in some cases just receive less pay. And what you find is that, on the whole, even though there are laws that say it is illegal to pay people different wages for doing the same work, women on average still tend to earn about 80 cents for every dollar men make. Although within younger generations, in some cases with like Generation Z, for example, you'll actually find that in some cases women are actually making more than men, because women are more likely to attend college. And there are later waves of feminism. There's a third wave of feminism that gets going at the end of the 20th century, and some would argue that we're actually in a fourth wave of feminism now, as there's debates about what it means, what it means to have womanhood, what it means to be a woman or to be female, which is a good intersection to talk about the emerging LGBT movement. The gay rights movement, what we would call the LGBT movement today, sometimes it's called the LGBTQ plus movement. There's a lot of different acronyms. They've been fighting for civil rights for many years, and they gained increased visibility after the Stonewall riots of 1969, and their movement will increase its visibility in the 1970s. as part of the broader New Left movement alongside feminism and other left-leaning movements. And it will become more socially acceptable for gay people to come out to their family and to their friends. Still, though, the idea of what it meant to be gay was different back then than now. Many people still referred to homosexuality as not being a sexual orientation, but being an alternative lifestyle, that it was something you choose to do rather than it being who you are as a person. During the 1970s, American culture reflected the division in society as a whole. Clothing styles became more individualistic as American consumers began to try new styles. In general, fashion choices also began to be less of an indicator of a person's political and social views, as had been the case in the 1960s. There was more in the 1970s. You could dress like a counterculturalist or a hippie without actually being a hippie, for example. Um, Another example, conservative males, even in the 1970s, they began to grow their hair longer and they began to wear beards and mustaches, even though those would have been more of a political statement back in the 60s and earlier. And women's styles become a lot more varied and generally less conformist. There's really a rebellion against the middle class, consumeristic, what we really would call technocratic styles of the 50s and 60s, in favor of this in the early 70s, this kind of boho, cottagecore, counterculture style that you see here on this slide here. Men's fashion in the 70s gets to be more casual as well. And although there is a lot of anti-war sentiment, military uniforms actually do have a significant impact on fashion in the 1970s, particularly the rise of what is called the leisure suit. Leisure suits are based on military uniforms with their chest pockets and the way they can be cinched around the waist with a belt, and they're more casual. You can wear them to work, but you can then also wear them to the discotheque. Maybe you loosen your tie, or you take off your tie, and then you pull out the really big collars that were really popular in the 1970s. So military service is still a part of men's fashion and what is seen as masculinity, even if anti-war sentiment is on the rise in the 70s. By the mid 70s, fashion changes again because this is a time of a lot of change. You see tight on the top, loose on the bottom looks, bell-bottom pants, tighter shirts and blouses for women. It's a more sexual type of fashion. It's a reflection of the sexual revolution. It's a reflection of the second wave feminist movement. It's a reflection of the emerging gay rights movement, and athletic wear also becomes a bit more common for everyday use, and it's no longer relegated just to being worn during sports and exercise. What we think of as athleisure becomes a bit more common in the 1970s. It really takes off though in the 80s, and you get a sense of some of these fashion choices. They're influenced by disco music as well. What's going to look good on the dance floor, and that's what you see in a movie like Saturday Night Fever from 1977 with John Travolta, a movie that really encapsulates the 1970s. John Travolta's character, he's a down and out working class guy. He's got a dead end job at the paint store, and he just lives for disco music and these disco dance contests that he gets involved in. A guy like him, 20 years earlier in the 50s, he probably would have been married. He would have had maybe even some young children. He would have lived a very different life. He might have had a much better job with a union in a factory, and that's just not going to be available to him in the 1970s because of all the stagflation and deindustrialization. And African American fashion changes as well, as it had been changing since the later part of the 1960s. African Americans have had a long history of expressing themselves through their sartorial choices, and they'll continue to do so for the 1970s as well. Back in the 1960s, African Americans, especially those that were in the civil rights movement, they dressed formally to appear clean cut and professional, and really to try to show that they were worthy of equality to whites. And by the late 60s and 70s, that begins to change thanks to the influence of the Black Power movement and the counterculture movement, and as well as some international African liberation movements in Africa. And new styles are going to become more popular. Black people dress informally. There is elements of military fashion, especially those who want to look like they're affiliated with the Black Panthers, leather jackets and berets to imitate the Black Panthers. You also have traditional African clothing items, what might be called African folk costume, often modified for African American wearers. But things like the dashiki become very popular for black men and for black women. And the Black is Beautiful movement really takes off. And black people, they change the style of clothing they're wearing, they change the way they are wearing their hair. They're rebelling against what they see as Western and white beauty standards, leading many to grow their hair out and to wear it as afros and to choose these new types of fashion. I would also add too, though, that international fashion just becomes bigger in general in the 1970s because global shipping, global trade, and fast fashion emerged in the 1970s. From the 1970s on, you can buy cheaper, in some cases, not as good quality of clothing, but this allows you to be more experimental with your fashion. If you want to wear a jumpsuit that's bright colored and made of polyester, it's cheaper, it causes you less money. So this allows fashion to be more individualistic and more experimental in the 70s. There's also some really interesting things that happen with media in the 1970s, whether it's music or film or television. In film, there's a lot of concern about environmental degradation and dystopias. It's a product of the Cold War. It's a product of fear about smog. They were actually much more concerned with global cooling in the 70s, whereas we're concerned more with global warming today. They're also very concerned about overpopulation in the 70s, whereas I think at this point we're probably actually more concerned about underpopulation and a rapidly aging population. Um, You have movies like Soylent Green from 1973, Rollerball from 1975, and Logan's Run from 1976, which are dystopian sci-fi films. And they're really very different than the retrofuturism, the optimistic futurism that you see in like the 1950s and the 1960s. These are opposite of shows like the Jetsons. They're a very pessimistic view of the future. There's one space movie though that's very optimistic though, and really much more escapist, and that's of course Star Wars 1977. But Star Wars isn't really a sci-fi movie. It's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Television had a lot of social commentary in the 1970s. You really see this with the CBS shows of Norman Lear. Norman Lear, who was the showrunner of several CBS productions, he was a liberal guy, um, and he believed in putting liberal social messaging into his productions. You really see this with the show All in the Family, which starred Carroll O'Connor, who was another liberal actor. He played Archie Bunker, who was meant to be a very unflattering portrayal of the older, often racially bigoted World War II greatest generation, and they're sparring with their now adult baby boomer children who are more progressive. And the thing is, though, Americans from all backgrounds like the show, even conservative viewers. They laughed at O'Connor's rather farcical portrayal of them. They would say, yes, Archie Bunker is a bigot, but I feel like I could go have a beer with him. And he's actually, maybe he has some racist beliefs, but he's got a heart of gold. Because what we really tried to do is O'Connor was meant to be kind of the heel, the antagonist of the show, and the audience was meant to sympathize with his baby boomer daughter and son-in-law, especially his son-in-law Stivic, who was played by Rob Reiner, who Archie Bunker called Meathead. Because he had liberal politics that were very different than his father-in-law. But I think Stivic came off as kind of preachy and sanctimonious, and even as a younger person watching the show, I actually in some ways identified more with Archie Bunker, even though I didn't share his beliefs about race and gender and things like that. He felt like more like a genuine, real person. But anyone who wants to study American film culture and study media literacy should definitely watch All in the Family, and particularly the character of Archie Bunker, because many other archetypical kind of father-dad characters on television shows are based on Archie Bunker. Homer Simpson from The Simpsons is an Archie Bunker. Peter Griffin from Family Guy is an Archie Bunker type character. And the show All in the Family was so popular, it led to several different spin-off shows, including Maude, which addressed women's issues, and Good Times, The Jeffersons, and there were many other African American shows that came out too. The African American characters on All in the Family got to have their own breakout shows as well, which featured African American casts in by the standards of the day in a way that was actually very not stereotypical, very non-stereotypical. These shows, they had black characters that were not stereotypes or that were not what is called blaxploitation characters, which is more what you saw on film. You definitely see this in Good Times and The Jeffersons, which are about working class African American families becoming middle class as opposed to being exploited. And there's other shows that were set in previous decades, although they aired in the 1970s. A couple of good examples of this are Happy Days and MASH. MASH was set in the Vietnam War. It was a movie before it was a television show. It's set in the Korean War, but it's really about the Vietnam War. And Happy Days is a very nostalgic show about the 1950s, which would have resonated with a lot of viewers in the 70s who longed for the economic prosperity and the consensus of the 50s. And a lot of conservative viewers really liked Happy Days. And I would say that on the whole, nostalgia for the past, for the 1950s, or even for the early 1960s, before counterculture got going, that's going to be popular in television shows and even in some films as well, like Animal House, for example. Grease is a movie that's set in sort of the 1950s era. It stars John Travolta, who was a very important 1970s movie star, and it's a very nostalgic portrayal of the 1950s. And Animal House is a movie that came out in the 70s that is actually set kind of in the early 60s as the counterculture movement is just starting to begin, as social division in America has not quite gotten to be such a high 1970s level yet. And music in the 1970s changed quite a bit across the decade. In the early 70s, it was all about rock and roll, being still heavily influenced by the counterculture movement of the 60s. As the 1970s went on, though, new music styles, namely disco and hip hop, emerge. And disco grew out of urban, inner city nightclub culture. It was popular music with African American, Latino people in big cities. It's been called the soul music in many cases of those communities, and it was played at nightclubs and discotheques. As time went on, though, it became more and more popular with white Americans, and as something becomes bigger and more accessible to everyday people across communities, it starts to get diluted and it starts to be not as cool and niche. Something similar happened with counterculture. Counterculture basically was defeated by its own success. And disco was also accelerated by the sexual revolution, by the feminist movement with its overlaps with more androgynous gender norms and more androgynous fashion choices, and drug use as well also plays into the increasing popularity of disco as well. And disco dancers are trying to express their individuality, but also their sexual liberation on the dance floor. And disco falls out of favor very quickly at the end of the 1970s. Rock makes a comeback. And this happened for a couple of reasons. I think disco music got to be too big, it was way too overplayed, and I think it just started to annoy people. And it was no longer edgy and cool anymore. I mean, ABBA, a very safe European pop band, they did a disco album, so it had gotten too big for its own success. And this leads to what was called Disco Demolition Night, July 12th, 1979. A lot of working class people in Comiskey Park for the Chicago White Sox, they took their disco records out onto the baseball diamond and they blew them up after a game against the Detroit Tigers. And critics of Disco Demolition Night said it was a racist and homophobic backlash to disco music. Others said that it was just because disco music was way too overplayed and people were sick and tired of it, so they blew it up. And that's more the attitude that I have. Hip hop music also develops in the 1970s, towards the end of the decade, out of the black and Latino music scenes in places like the Bronx and New York City, and it incorporated elements of blues, jazz, the Detroit Motown style, and it also involved elements of spoken word poetry. A lot of the first rappers who developed songs like Rapper's Delight, 1979, it comes out of spoken word poetry and party emceeing. And so rappers will eventually become mainstream music artists, as will disc jockeys or DJs. Wrapping up the 1970s, I want to go over some really impactful Supreme Court cases because these are things that as an American citizen you'll need to know, but also if you're in the state of Florida, you'll need to know about them for the civic literacy exam. And the court that represented the Supreme Court that represented America in the 1970s was the Burger Court, which is in power from 1969 to 1986. The Burger Court, which by the way sounds like a really terrible fast food restaurant, it's considered less liberal than the Warren Court, but less conservative than the later Rehnquist Court, by the standards of the day, of course. Chief Justice Warren Burger, who you see at the center of this slide here, standing next to President Jimmy Carter. He was nominated by Nixon in 1969 and confirmed by the Senate. And the court took a less broad view of First Amendment and other early Bill of Rights protections, but it does actually broadly expand understandings of the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment deals with equal protection under the law. And I think this focus on the 14th Amendment, it really reflects the increasing mistrust of American institutions that gets going in the latter part of the 1960s and then will last throughout the 1970s. This was a period of declining social trust, declining political trust, thanks to the Vietnam War, thanks to Watergate, thanks to all the economic problems that the country faced. You can see why the Burger Court would have been more focused on equal protection in the 14th Amendment than previous courts. And here is a survey of U.S. public trust in the government. And you'll notice that there's a precipitous decline across the 1970s, although there had been a lot of decline in the 1960s as well, again, because of the Vietnam War and how America got into that conflict. You see social trust rebuilds a little bit in the 80s and 90s, but not to pre-1960s levels, not like it was before 1963. The Kennedy assassination. And you'll notice that there was a bit of an increase in social trust in the early 2000s after 9/11, but in the present, social trust is now at its lowest it's ever been in America. Social trust is lower than it's ever been, but we're not nearly as violent now as we were in the 1970s and 1960s. Some of this may be because our population on average is older now. The baby boomers are at this point mostly geriatric, mostly over the age of 60. But it also may be because we have so many other outlets and safety valves for protest now. Now we have the internet. We can vent our frustrations not by marching, but by saying crazy things on social media and the internet. I'm going to go through the next couple of slides very quickly. Feel free to pause the video if you like. This is from Pew Research Center. Again, trust in institutions declines in the 1970s. And this is not just political institutions, but social institutions as well. And rebuilds a little bit at certain points. It rebuilds a little bit around 9/11, but then continues to collapse throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s. This is a study done by MIT in 2022 using Gallup polling data and data from some other firms as well. And it's support for institutions, both very concrete institutions like the U.S. military and more intangible ones like science. And what you'll see across the vast majority of institutions between the 1970s and the present is that trust declines significantly. And this study is interesting because it breaks down the institutions with a lot of detail. It gets very granular. It also breaks down support between Republicans and Democrats as well. And what you'll see is that amongst both groups, the vast majority of institutions, the trust in them declines, regardless of what institution you're talking about or the political affiliations of the people you're polling. The only significant exception that you see on this slide of an increase in trust is the military, which that makes sense because its trust is being rebuilt after the Vietnam conflict. This is some very interesting longue-durée, long-term data from Stephen Mihm, a professor of history at the University of Georgia. He actually does some really cool work with food history as well. He argues that the mistrust institutions that we see from the 1960s to the present is actually not abnormal and it's not exceptional. Really, the trust in institutions that we have in the World War II and early Cold War years, he argues is actually the exception in American history, that for most of American history we have a lot of mistrust in institutions. And he argues that one of the reasons why you have high social trust in this period of the 1920s, 1930s, Great Depression era, New Deal era, World War II era, early Cold War era, into the 50s and early 60s, is because of low immigration numbers. And you may agree with Mihm on this, you may disagree with him on this, but it's something to think about, especially the idea that social trust is actually an unusual thing, and that it exists for a short period of really only a couple of decades in American history. So with this data about social trust declining in mind, let's talk about the Supreme Court cases of the Burger Court. We'll start with NYT, New York Times v. USA, 1971. In 1967, the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the New York Times and WAPO, the same publication that published the Watergate story. The papers revealed that there was a lack of planning and a lack of preparedness in the executive branch regarding the Vietnam War. It also highlighted that there was significant civil military disagreement over the war, and many military officers expressed the belief that the war was unwinnable based on the rules of engagement that had been established by civilian leadership, whether it was the president or the Secretary of Defense. And it makes JFK and LBJ look bad. In my opinion, and there's been a lot of scholarship on these papers as well in recent years. President Nixon actually will try to suppress the papers, citing national security concerns, even though Nixon is not in the White House or in the cabinet in this period. He still tried to suppress them because it showed that military voices were concerned about the war being unwinnable. In a Supreme Court case of 6-3, the Supreme Court decided the government had not proven that the publication of the papers was a national security threat. There were dissenters, including Chief Justice Berger, a Nixon appointee, said the executive branch should be deferred to on matters of national security. And again, this case is there to highlight increasing mistrust of U.S. institutions, especially the executive branch. And when people mistrust institutions, they're going to want to protect their equal protection rights. In 1972, you have the Wisconsin v. Yoder case. Jonas Yoder and other Amish families refused to enroll their children in high school, violating Wisconsin's compulsory education laws. Yoder and the families cited their religious freedom, their First Amendment rights, and in some ways their 14th Amendment rights, their rights to equal protection under the law as well, are relevant here too. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court actually agreed with them, but the case was appealed to the Supreme Court, which sided 7-0, 7-0 with the families. That their First Amendment parental rights superseded the state's interest in education. And other points about the Wisconsin v. Yoder case. There's going to be increased attention to religious rights post the Engel v. Vitale case, which ended public prayer in school in many ways to protect the religious rights of people who were not practicing monotheistic religions, or who are not religious at all. There's also going to be an increased use of homeschooling after this decision as well. It's going to be easier to remove your children from regular school and homeschool them yourself, and have the parents take responsibility for education. And I should add also that the Amish may not continue education past 8th grade, but it doesn't mean they stop educating their children. They begin to train them in vocational sectors rather than in traditional college preparatory high school. This is by far the most famous of the Burger Court cases. It's Roe versus Wade, 1973. A woman in Texas named Norma McCorvey, alias Jane Roe, claimed to have been SA'd and was seeking to terminate the resulting pregnancy, which was denied under Texas law. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, which ruled 7-2 that the Texas law was a violation of the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Due process, equal protection of the law, those are being violated because McCorvey's right to privacy was being endangered by the state of Texas. She could not make this what they saw as a private decision with her physician about the fact that she was pregnant. They also built on the Griswold case, Griswold v. Connecticut case of 1965, which that really introduced the idea of right to privacy even before Roe versus Wade. And basically, the case Roe versus Wade made abortion after or before viability, which could be 24 to 28 weeks, depending on which doctor you ask. Basically, abortion up to this point could be legal, with some considerations for things like SA after 28 weeks. States still had the authority to place some restrictions on abortion, but they could not ban it entirely, and that was reaffirmed with the Planned Parenthood v. Casey case action in 1992. And Roe versus Wade was overturned in 2022 with the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health case. And the Dobbs case, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the Dobbs case actually did. It did not make abortion illegal nationwide or even illegal within a single state. What it did was it determined that the states had were to decide whether abortion was legal or not, that abortion not being protected by the 14th Amendment, that the right to privacy was not part of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Therefore, because it's not specifically listed or enumerated in the Constitution, it's a matter of the states. That's what the 10th Amendment says. That if something's not specifically listed in the Constitution, it's a state matter. And so in recent years, states have had ballot issues about abortion, and in some states, even more conservative ones like Ohio and Kansas, have either added abortion to viability to their state constitutions, or they've rejected proposals to restrict it. So it's actually many people who are against abortion or pro-life, as they're often called, they celebrated the Dobbs case in 2022, but in some ways it actually had some perhaps unintended consequences for the anti-abortion or pro-life movement. On the other side of things, the pro-abortion or pro-choice side, they were very dissatisfied with Roe versus Wade being overturned, but in some ways they've actually had some pretty significant gains, as abortion has been an issue that's been sent back to the states now. This is U.S. v. Nixon, 1974. It's directly related to the Watergate case. During the Watergate investigation, Nixon refused to turn over Oval Office recordings, which was a violation of a congressional subpoena. He cited executive privilege, that as the president, he had the right to do so to protect the country's national security and things of that nature. And the Supreme Court decided 8-0 that executive privilege did not apply here because executive privilege was not absolute, especially in criminal proceedings where military or diplomatic interests are not at stake. And this really curtails the power of the President of the United States. And there's a push to do this in the 1970s because of the Vietnam War and then because of Watergate. And this case is part of a larger trend of restricting executive authority since the Vietnam War, since the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which greatly increased executive power to prosecute military operations. You see this with the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which forbade the President of the United States from deploying troops without congressional notice and for more than 60 days. And now you have executive privilege being declared not to be absolute. And again, this is part of that larger mistrust in institutions, particularly mistrust of the executive branch. And this mistrust is not without reason in the 1970s. This is Regents of the University of California v. Bakke, 1978. Again, it's people not trusting higher education or affirmative action laws. Alan Bakke, who you can see at the bottom right of this slide, he applied to UC Davis's medical school and was rejected twice. Bakke was an older white male. He was a military veteran. He had very good scores, and he was a very, very smart guy. He'd actually been an engineer for NASA before he decided to have a career change and go to medical school. Affirmative action in the 1970s worked differently than it did in later decades. Basically, what they had was seats or positions for affirmative action placements, which would have included women and minorities like African Americans. And Bakke and his team of lawyers argued that he had been denied a seat at the University of California Davis Law School because of these affirmative action seats, and that the 16 students that were going to enter the program with affirmative action, they had lower qualifications than him. They had lower test scores, they had lower work experience, they were not veterans, they did not have the educational background that he did. He called it, and his people called it, reverse discrimination, a term that you sometimes see used today. Reverse discrimination, reverse racism, the idea that he as a white male was being discriminated against because of these affirmative action policies, and that this was a violation of his 14th Amendment rights, his due process, and his equal protection, and also a violation of his 1964 Civil Rights Act rights as well, because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does not just apply to African Americans, it applies to all Americans. And the court upheld affirmative action, but they declared that race could be considered in admissions to redress historic inequities, but that strict quotas by race, like having 16 affirmative action slots in your program, that was unconstitutional. That basically affirmative action could continue, but it had to be done in a more holistic manner to be fairer to people who had very high qualifications but might not receive affirmative action because they were not from historically marginalized groups. In the end, Bakke was enrolled in UC Davis. He graduated at the age of 42, and he became a very successful anesthesiologist. This case was upheld by the 2003 Gredinger v. Bollinger case, but it was overturned fairly recently by the 2023 Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard case, which overturned affirmative action in some college admissions. And that case was actually driven in large part by Asian students who were actually not being helped by affirmative action, but in some ways were actually being hindered by affirmative action because they were deemed to be overrepresented in colleges and universities. And they argued many of the same points that Bakke argued back in the 1970s. But affirmative action can be a contentious issue. Many people felt like that it was a necessary step to redress grievances. Others have said that it was actually just another form of racism, and that it was racism against white people and against Asians. And some African Americans even have condemned affirmative action. People like Clarence Thomas, the second black Supreme Court justice, he argued that affirmative action, which he said that he benefited from, it made people think that he had not gotten his education and his credentials through his hard work, but through affirmative action. So in some cases, some African Americans have criticized affirmative action, but it was and will likely remain a contentious issue in the future. Wrapping things up, the 1970s was a difficult and chaotic time for Americans from a variety of backgrounds. White people, black people, conservatives, liberals, Democrats, Republicans, women, men were all very critical of the division of the 70s, the economic challenges of the 70s. Many conservative people I've talked to really don't like the 70s. They feel that it was a period of moral decline as well as economic decline. Many liberals don't like the 70s very much either. They feel that the goals of the civil rights movement were not fully realized. They don't like the political direction the country went in the 1970s. Hunter S. Thompson, the very famous gonzo journalist, he described the 1970s, particularly the early 1970s, as a foul time in American history. John Lennon of the Beatles, he said famously, "Weren't the 70s a drag?" So across the political spectrum and across communities, you find discontent with the 70s. The decade begins with a bloody and demoralizing war, and an embarrassing political scandal, the Vietnam War and Watergate, and ends with an energy crisis, an economic recession, and Americans being held captive by a hostile nation, Iran. And people of all perspectives have significant dissatisfaction with the decade. And by the end of the 1970s, most Americans just want change.